Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 16. Something that is nothing. 1. As the sun began to set, the forest rapidly darkened. Leyla looked at the dead bird with unfocused eyes while Matthias stared at Leyla. There was a long moment of silence, but Matthias wasn't impatient. Leyla was right in front of him and he believed she probably wouldn't able to run away for a while. Leyla soon lifted her head. Her eyes were filled with indignation that even the darkness couldn't hide. Her eyes were arrogant and daring, but he thought that was much better than avoiding eye contact. Just tell me. What did I do wrong? Wrong? Yes. What kind of wrongdoing did I commit for me? For me to get punished like this? I never gave you any punishment. Matthias answered quite seriously. I did my job, and you did yours, Leyla. He was sincere. Wrongdoing. Well, after a moment of thought, Matthias looked at Leyla with a subdued look. Why do you like birds so much? The same question was asked with a tone that wasn't a bit different from a little while ago. When she opened her tightly shut eyes, Leyla looked at the sky, the dead bird, and then at Matthias again. Her shoulders were trembling, but her eyes were wide open. Matthias found it quite hilarious and a little irritating. For always being by my side, Leyla Lewellin clearly answered. She sounded a little furious, but she wasn't threatening. I've always been wandering around so many places ever since I was a child, but the birds were always there wherever I went. Always near me. When the seasons changed, some of the birds that left never failed to come back when I waited for them. The birds always returned. Leyla's voice calmed down as she continued to speak. Her voice sounded very delicate. It was perhaps because of her soft pronunciation. There are no seasons without birds. There are no places that don't have birds. I love being around those beautiful and free creatures. Really? Yes. Although my words may be meaningless to the Duke. Bluffing with a face that's about to cry. Matthias stood up with a low snicker. His dinner feast was drawing near before he knew it. Are you going to hunt like this again? Leyla hurriedly asked him as he was about to make his leave. If necessary, Matthias answered with no hesitation. At that moment when Leyla's eyes filled up with despair, fear, and anger, Matthias was pleased. Leyla. After changing his mind to pass by her, Matthias stopped in front of her. I want everything in my world to be in its place. In a place where nothing needlessly hides or runs away. What do you mean? Stay in your place. I don't know what you mean by place. Think it over, Duke. Who knows? If you find the answer, I might start having friendly hunting sessions. Matthias turned with no hesitation while Leyla was left behind in a daze. He really didn't want much from Leyla Lewellin. However, he wanted Leyla to be in Leyla's position. As an orphan who lives in the forest. As a curious schoolgirl. And soon, as a female teacher at the place where she should be in. Sitting on the back of his horse, Matthias turned his head and looked towards the bush. Leyla had crouched her small body in front of the dead bird. Seeing her cheeks sparkling, he believed she was probably crying. There was a sense of satisfaction in Matthias's eyes when he saw the tears. He was born into a world dominated by perfect order and was soon to become its master. Everything was simple and clear under that order. It was not at all difficult to live up to a given role and expectation. The grandmother's and mother's proud successor. The generous master to the people of Arvis. The brilliant officer on the battlefield. The director's competent businessman. Matthias was always someone something and was willing to play the appropriate role. The people who treated him were no different. The prescribed roles, attitudes, and refined emotions came and went by him in an orderly fashion. Those were the feelings that Matthias saw, heard, and learned. But that lowly orphan who lives in my forest? Matthias's eyes at Leyla narrowed. She's nothing. The easy conclusion made Matthias smile. It was his first time to have something that was nothing. There weren't any unnecessary stains needed in Duke Herhardt's life. It was strange to have something that wasn't necessary in his life. But he thought it wasn't too bad. The emotions that woman, who was nothing, showed toward him entertained him. Just like the moment of a flying bird falling to its death entertained him. Most of all, the tears. He liked the crying Leyla. She was a woman who cried prettily. pretty enough to make her cry again and again. Matthias left the forest with a lighter heart. The usual routine was repeated in the mansion he returned to. The boisterous dinner time. The empty but elaborate conversations. The cold champagne and the phony laughters. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. When the short summer night passed and morning came again, Matthias thought it wouldn't be too bad to do a friendly hunt next time. When he looked out the window, Leyla was there in the rose garden. She was silently helping out with the gardener's work. See? Matthias turned away from the window with a smile. Plus, it's easy, Leyla. Thank you, Leyla. Claudine kindly expressed her gratitude. Claudine's friend, who had sat beside her, also thanked Leyla with a slightly pulled smile. No problem, miss. Leyla politely bowed. Her white hands were grasped together. There were grass stains at the end of her fingertips, which were from the flowers she had picked. There were also several blood-stained wounds from the rose thorns that had stabbed her fingers. Can you cut off that red rose as well? I think a bundle would be enough. Claudine cut off Leyla's words with a gentle question. Leyla turned her head and looked towards the direction that Claudine had pointed to. It was the central flower bed of the garden. There were splendidly colored red roses in full bloom. Yes, miss. Leyla obediently followed orders as usual. Claudine quietly looked at Leyla's distant back as Leyla grabbed her basket and scissors again. Claudine had found Leyla while walking in the garden with a friend who had visited Arvis. After being out of sight for several days, she was now working diligently today to help the gardener. Claudine changed their plans to have tea together and then suggested arranging flowers to her friend. Amelia agreed with delight, and the floral arrangements for the two ladies were prepared under the pergola that was beneath the vine roses. And then Claudine sent a maid to call Leyla. They've been like that since childhood. It was Leyla Lewellin's job to pick up the roses Claudine needed whenever she started arranging flowers under the pergola. She was not enough to be Claudine's playmate, but Leyla followed errands well. On days where everything was boring, Claudine occasionally called for Leyla to say a few words. That girl, she acts very politely, but it strangely feels arrogant. Amelia pouted her lips as she watched Leyla. What should I say? It seems like she doesn't know her circumstances that well. Don't be like that, Amelia. Leyla is a pitiful child. Claudine lightly frowned. The rose branches were cut off with the scissors that Leyla had given her. Of course, she does have some flaws, but let's still be tolerant of her. Amelia grinned at Claudine's words. Well, you're too generous to your residents. Residents who do their part faithfully should be respected. Claudine's voice got lower and softer. The blue porcelain vase was filled one by one with the flowers she trimmed. Leyla soon returned with a bundle of red roses. Again, with impeccable politeness, Leyla bowed and put the roses on the table. Claudine stopped her moving hands and looked at Leyla. Amelia's critique of Leyla was correct. Claudine, who had seen that child for a long time, agreed with Amelia's remarks. Claudine had a vague idea of why Amelia was able to make such a critique. Leyla Lewellin's docile demeanor seemed like it actually came through her unconcerned attitude. There were famous aristocratic daughters who were anxious to be friends with Claudine, and yet, Leyla was not excited or pleased at all whenever Claudine was near her. Leyla didn't bother to look good in front of Claudine. She never flattered Claudine either. She was just that type to submissively endure and follow orders. Claudine wasn't used to such indifference. The fact that Claudine had received such indifference from the orphan made her feel humiliated. Good work, Leyla. Claudine smiled. Leyla stepped back as she bowed and the maid, who was waiting a few steps away, approached Leyla. It was the moment Claudine had looked forward to the most. The moment when Leyla's authentic emotions were revealed through her eyes when she was given the gold coin in her hands. After all these years, Leyla still couldn't maintain her composure when she was presented with the gold coin. Claudine was satisfied when Leyla's hand that held the gold coin trembled as if she was holding a hot potato. Claudine was planning to present her with another gift to top it off. An invitation to the party that would give that pitiful child a beautiful memory. Are you giving this to me? Layla's eyes grew bigger when she received an invitation from the same maid who had provided her the gold coin. She looked very flustered. Yes. I had asked for permission and the two madams allowed it. But, miss, I really want you to come, Leyla. Claudine smiled as she cut off Layla's words again. Layla's face turned pale while Claudine's smile grew brighter. I'm sure you won't refuse my invitation. After Claudine spoke to Leyla as if she was her longtime childhood friend, Claudine then turned her eyes away. I'm going to have to tame that stiff child before I become Duchess of Arvis. Claudine started to trim the red roses while calmly reflecting on her intentions. The rose vase decorated by the skilled Claudine was perfectly beautiful. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 17. Like a surprise present, Mr. Remmer's Leyla was invited to the Duke's party. The rumor quickly spread among the residents of Arvis. Everyone was initially puzzled, but at the end, they expressed their sympathy for Leyla. The people who lived at Arvis well knew how Lady Brandt treated the pitiful Leyla like her dog. I don't get why all the aristocrats are so malicious. Upon hearing the news, Mrs. Mona, the cook, immediately rushed to the cabin that afternoon. The news was a bolt out of the blue for Bill Remmer, who was taking a break from the midday heat. The aristocrats say that they're being considerate, but how intimidated Leyla would be in such a place. Leyla isn't that type of child to get intimidated by things like that. She can just show her face for a while and come back. Men. They know nothing. Mrs. Mona shed a tear while Bill scratched his neck and put out his cigarette. Let's show them what they deserve. What the hell do you mean? What else do you think I mean? With Layla's pretty looks, let's take the aristocrat ladies down a peg or two. No, why are you so? I knew it. Were you thinking of sending Leyla to the party in her uniform? What's wrong with school uniforms? When Bill made a puzzled look, Mrs. Mona tisked and shook her head. Look here, Bill Remmer. Don't you think you should know how to raise a daughter now, after all these years? What do you mean, daughter? I'm just still thinking about where to send her. Sure. That thinking you do. You'll think when you send Leyla off on her wedding day, think when you hold her children, and think even when you're in your coffin. No. How can you possibly send that little girl away to a marriage? You're talking nonsense. Mrs. Mona's lips softened after she saw Bill heat up with anger. And you say she's not your daughter? You're a man I really can't understand. If you're going to keep talking nonsense, leave. Let's buy her a fetching dress, Mr. Remmer. Like a surprise present. She's a girl. How happy would she be? Mrs. Mona emphatically said as if it was a command. Layla's not that kind of child to ask for a dress, and you're not the type of person to care. So I have no choice but to come forward. I'll help you. How? If you pay for the dress, I'll prepare it for her. Then go ahead. While grumbling, Bill entered the house and brought out his purse. He always kept money in the cabin because he distrusted the bank. Leyla, who had been to the goat's cage, returned when Mrs. Mona steadily accepted the money for the dress, including the shoes. The two hurriedly hid the traces of their deal and acted in pretense. Leyla offered her a cup of tea, but Mrs. Mona refused and left the cabin. In the meantime, Bill hid his purse into his back pocket. Did Mrs. Mona nag you about me again? I haven't been climbing trees lately, Leyla anxiously asked after sitting on a chair next to Bill. It's not like that, so don't worry about it. Bill cleared his throat and then lit up a cigarette he had extinguished for a while. I'm glad to hear that. Leyla smiled and leaned deep into her chair after taking off her hat. This summer, Bill was more than happy to see Layla's straw hat she wore every day. When he thought it would be several times more rewarding to see Leyla dressed up in a lavish dress, he no longer regretted giving his money to Mrs. Mona. Leyla looked at Bill when he suddenly called her name. What are you planning to do? The Duke's party. I'm just going to stop by and show my face. The Etman household was also invited, so I decided to go with Kyle. Really? That herbivorous glutton is finally paying off all that food he ate in my house. Bill felt a deep sense of relief when he heard Kyle's name. Bill deeply trusted Kyle. Even so, don't you need anything? Clothes to wear, things like that? I'm fine, Uncle. What do you mean you're fine? Are you planning to wear your uniform? That's not a bad idea. Leyla snickered playfully. Her face looked so calm that Bill was lost in thoughts. Do I really not know how to raise a daughter? No, Bill muttered to himself in astonishment. What do you mean, daughter? What nonsense. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. He shook his head. Leyla looked at Bill with a confused look on her face. He felt uncomfortable when he saw the glittering glasses on her small face. Bill was well aware of the child's struggles to avoid causing trouble and not be indebted to him if possible. It was understandable. Nevertheless, he didn't know how to comfort her, so he always said blunt things to her. He admitted that Mrs. Mona, although she was somewhat extreme, had made a brilliant decision to surprise Leyla with a dress and shoes. Leyla. Bill gathered up his courage and called her name again. The weather is awfully hot. The words he had originally wanted to say failed to come out. Bill cleared up his throat after saying useless things. Leyla laughed and gently grasped his hand that was on the chair's armrest. I'm the one who should be comforting you instead. Even with a sour look on his face, Bill couldn't shake off that little hand. Leyla gave him a smile. She was a child that smiled gorgeously. Leyla woke up instantaneously. It was dawn, and the room was filled with ink-colored darkness. Lying motionless, Leyla slowly looked around. Familiar ceiling. Window with creamy curtains. Old desk with a few books spread out on it. Soft quilt with a faint smell of sunlight. I'm in my room. A sigh of relief came out when she realized where she was. She had a nightmare after a long time. She was reminded of the time when she was left all alone in this world and had moved around the homes of her relatives. Every day, she had experienced a repetition of nightmares until she met Uncle Bill. But her memory of the house that instilled her fear of water remained deep and clear. This is all because of her. When her uncle was drunk, he had expressed his anger at Leyla. He was a timid and quiet man when he was sober, but the uncle Leyla remembered was a man who was drunk 5 days a week. On the days when he lost his money at the gambling table, he became more aggressive. He had cursed and smacked Leyla without fail. She hated him. She despised him. But all Leyla Lewellin, the orphan who had nowhere else to go, could do was to bear it. Leyla desperately tried her best. She helped with housework without a break. She tried to eat less. Like an object placed at the corner of the house, she barely moved around. Yet, on the day she was eventually kicked out of the house, her aunt handed her a paper bag with some cookies in it. Leyla received the paper bag and greeted her bruised aunt goodbye. Leyla took out a cookie and ate it in the back of the wagon before heading to her next relative's house. Her heart broke because the chocolate cookies were so delicious. But Leyla didn't cry. She practiced smiling on the way to her destination. The more she wanted to cry, the brighter she smiled. No one in this world liked crying orphans. Her smile had improved after getting kicked out again and again. But she wasn't able to easily smile when she had to cross the border to Berg. The young Leyla believed the one address grasped in her hand was her last hope. If she was abandoned again, she was forced to go to an orphanage. Leyla still couldn't forget the day she had her best smile the moment she met Uncle Bill's eyes, which were full of warmth and compassion. She would never forget the day she finally had a family and a house that she would always want to go back to. So everything was all right. Leyla relieved herself and lightly got out of bed. The Duke's party was held this evening. Leyla didn't want to mind or dwell much about it. She was planning to proudly attend the party and quietly leave. Lady Claudine didn't know how much Leyla was willing to do anything for Uncle Bill in this warm cabin. Leyla opened her window. She hurriedly washed her face and changed her clothes. When she vigorously opened the door, she saw Uncle Bill, who was already prepared to go out for gardening. Let's go together, Uncle. Tilda. When the afternoon came, the mansion was already ready to welcome guests. It was a large-scale party, but it was a daily part of the life of the Arvis residents. They did what they had to do in their respective positions. All that remained left was the sun to set to mark the start of the fancy party. No one in this Arvis was worried about the success of today's party. For tonight's party would have been perfect, as was everything that lay in the Herhardt's name. Matthias left the dressing room in his evening coat. He left a colder impression whenever he combed his hair back and revealed his forehead and eyebrows. The faint smile on the tip of his lips had failed to soften his sharp facial features and his piercing eyes. "It went well as you ordered, Master," Hassan whispered. Matthias turned around with a cigarette in his hand and slightly raised his eyebrow. "They left about an hour ago, so the prepared items must have been delivered by now." "I see." After he nodded, Matthias lit the end of the cigarette that was in between his lips. "Well done." Hassan bowed his head at Matthias's response with a slight smile. The news that Claudine had invited Leyla Lewellin to the party came to Matthias through his mother's mouth. His mother praised the kind-hearted Claudine, who had shown compassion and charity to the poor orphan. Matthias didn't bother to oppose because he thought it would be quite an entertaining sight. The sight of Leyla arriving to the party in her shabby clothes, and Claudine showing her full sympathy and kindness. Matthias seemed to know what aspect of Leyla Lewellin was stimulating Claudine. Leyla was an annoying little girl, so it was quite the enjoyment to break her pride. That was why he didn't want to give her to Claudine. All that enjoyment and pleasure belonged to him and him only. Matthias von Herhardt didn't know how to share his own with others. "What shall I do with these, Master?" Hassan pointed to the box near the fireplace where the fire was put out. It was the gift box the chef had prepared for Bill Remmer. The gift, which was supposed to be delivered to Bill Remmer's cabin today, was moved here through Hassan. Hassan had switched the chef's gift with the box Matthias had ordered him to prepare. Matthias slowly smoked as he gazed at the gift. It was not that difficult to guess what was in it without opening it. "Get rid of it." His order that flowed out with the cigarette smoke was calm. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 18. Emerald. "Uncle, this is too much." Leyla, who looked into the box with wide eyes, said in a trembling voice. Bill couldn't find a suitable rebuttal. He too was surprised. "How much did you spend?" Leyla gave Bill a look of reproach. "No. Well, I've spent enough. You care too much about everything." Bill barely came to his senses when he answered back. The dress Mrs. Mona prepared had arrived at the cabin on the day of the party. Bill believed the mailman would bring the dress in, but a young man who seemed to be an employee of the dress shop delivered it himself. Bill thought Mrs. Mona must have paid special attention to the dress well enough for the nicely dressed employee to deliver it directly to them. When Leyla opened the box, the dress was beyond Bill's expectations. Even in Bill's eyes, who didn't know a thing about women's clothes and accessories, the white dress stitched with gold threads looked very luxurious and heavenly. The same was true of the shoes, gloves, and the necklace. "How much did I pay Mrs. Mona again?" Bill calculated with his fingers folded. "But did she take the money for the necklace?" Bill was puzzled and had calculated again while Leyla firmly covered the box lid. "Why? You don't like it?" "No way." "Then why?" "Let's return it. I can't let you spend this much money on a party that lasts for just one day." Unlike Mrs. Mona's assurance that the gift would thrill her, Leyla simply looked worried. "Leyla, if you don't wear this to the party, I won't ever see you again." Bill's face suddenly turned cold. "You always don't want to be indebted to me. I know your reasons, but Leyla, you shouldn't draw a clear line between me and you." "Uncle, if you don't take it, I'll just use it as a firecracker. And I'll never see you again, Leyla." The red-faced Bill stepped out of the front door as if he was running away. As he circled around the flower bed and smoked, his mind was filled with late regrets for saying such mean words to the child. He didn't mean it when he said he'd never see her again. While Bill was wondering if he should go back in, Kyle walked in from the other side of the road in his tailcoat. Bill used to believe Kyle was just a little boy who always pretended to be an adult, but seeing him dressed up so nicely, Bill realized that he was all grown up now. "Mr. Remmer. What about Leyla?" Kyle excitedly asked. "Well, I don't know." "What? Layla's not home? The party's about to begin." "Not really, but..." While Bill hesitated, not knowing how to explain the situation, the front door creaked open. The two men inadvertently turned their heads and gasped. An unfamiliar Leyla stood there. "Kyle, don't I look weird?" Leyla asked with a grimace. "I feel so awkward wearing these clothes." "You're pretty." "Kyle, who had barely been able to speak for a while, decisively cut Layla's words. "You're beautiful, Leyla. I mean it," Kyle said once again with conviction. His childlike smile disappeared as his face turned red. He was aware that Uncle Bill was planning to prepare a gift for Leyla, but he had never imagined it would be this much. He was really worried about Bill's eye for picking tacky things, but this was. "Wake up, Kyle Edman." Bill clicked his tongue and patted Kyle's flustered back. "You're going in my place today." Bill looked at Kyle with a serious look. "That means you have to take responsibility and protect her. You can do it, right?" "Of course, Mr. Remmer," Kyle replied emphatically. "I'll make sure to protect her." Bill burst out laughing when he watched Kyle vow with a crimson-red face. In the meantime, Leyla took a cautious step towards Kyle. Kyle relieved his beating chest with repeated deep breaths and reached out his hand in a dignified manner. "What's this?" Leyla confusedly asked about his hand, but Kyle didn't panic. "Today's the party. And we're partners." "Yeah, so." Kyle mustered up his courage and led Layla's hand over his arm. "It's what it's supposed to be. Being your partner for the party." Kyle was so nervous, he almost stammered. Leyla, after being lost in thought for a while, nodded assiduously and lightly linked her arms around Kyle's. "Let's go, Kyle." The moment Layla smiled brighter than the sun, Kyle thought, "I will never forget this moment for the rest of my life." Leyla Lewellin appeared with the doctor's son. When Matthias was greeting the guests, he suddenly turned his eyes and saw Leyla entering the hall under Kyle Edman's escort. Hassan had proved himself to be the most competent butler through Layla's appearance. Leyla Lewellin was gorgeous with the outfit Hassan picked. Matthias believed she would still be beautiful, even with the shabby gift the chef had chosen for her. Matthias's gaze shifted from her shoes, her dress, and then to the necklace that adorned Layla's white, slender neck. It was a stunning necklace pieced together by pearls and emeralds. Hassan prepared the dress and shoes, but Matthias chose the necklace. It was unexpected. He was on his way to the hotel because he had an appointment and saw the necklace in a display window near the hotel. The lucid green color of the emerald, delicately crafted, was quite impressive. While he was returning to his estate that day, Matthias had instructed Hassan to buy the necklace. "Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Leyla noticed Matthias's gaze as she suddenly turned her head. Her eyes, resembling the lively summer forest, stopped exactly on Matthias's face. Leyla seemed to recognize who he was only after she squinted her eyes. Unlike Matthias, who looked at her with an unwavering stare, Leyla avoided eye contact in surprise. She tightly held the boy's arm and hid behind him. "Long time no see, Duke Herhardt." Matthias turned away after a familiar face gave a greeting. With a modest smile, he welcomed the guest and exchanged brief regards. Although his mind was in a different place, Matthias was able to perfectly accomplish his job. When Matthias turned his eyes again, Leyla and the boy were moving away to the other side of the hall. Kyle Edman triumphantly escorted Leyla. He led that woman and acted as if she was his. "This is Leyla. She's my friend." Claudine took Leyla to another group of ladies. "Hello. I'm Leyla Lewellin." And Leyla did her part again with a polite greeting. She acted as if she was a doll without any will or emotion. Claudine gave a gleaming smile and continued to introduce her to other people. Claudine was satisfied with how obedient and kind Leyla was. "Leyla's preparing to become a teacher. Isn't that wonderful?" The ladies agreed with Claudine's proud praise in unison and complimented Leyla. Their compliments were a tribute to Lady Claudine, who regarded the poor orphan as her friend. The ladies knew the two couldn't be real friends, and that reality didn't impair Claudine's dignity. "Oh, Claudine. I heard you're about to get engaged." One of the ladies gracefully changed the subject as if she was done talking about an orphan who was about to become a teacher. Everyone's interests were now focused on Claudine Brandt's engagement. Claudine took a shy and humble attitude. Since the engagement hadn't been officially announced yet, it was frivolous to act as if she had already become Duchess Herhardt. "The Duke Herhardt is here." Another lady standing in the opposite direction of Claudine gasped in admiration. Everyone's eyes moved toward the direction the lady pointed at. "Leyla, who had a perfunctory smile this whole time, had widened her eyes along with Claudine. Matthias brushed past Leyla and naturally stood beside Claudine. Claudine wrapped her arms around his. Leyla's face, when she glanced at the two, was visibly paler than before. "They're my friends, Duke Herhardt." When Claudine started introducing them, Matthias greeted them elegantly. Matthias's gaze, as he looked at one person after another, stopped on Leyla's face standing at the end of the group. "It's Leyla." Claudine tightly grasped Matthias's arm. "You couldn't recognize her, right? She's so different than usual that I almost didn't recognize her either." Leyla blushed in embarrassment at what Claudine said in the guise of sarcasm. No matter what insults Claudine gave towards the emotionless Leyla, Leyla always seemed to react differently when Matthias was in front of her. Excuse me." A warm voice dissipated the sudden silence. It was Kyle Ettman, the boy who had been loitering around with a disapproving look ever since Claudine took Leyla away. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but may I take my partner now?" Kyle held Leyla's hand without hesitation. She seemed a little surprised, but Leyla didn't refuse his touch. Rather, she looked as if she was a lost child who had found her parents. "My friends are also eagerly waiting to be introduced to Leyla." Unlike his gentle demeanor, Kyle's eyes on Claudine were firm and cold. "Then I'll have to give my permission. We can't keep holding Leyla on for too long." Claudine willingly nodded her head and looked at Matthias. Matthias was watching Leyla and Kyle with insensitive eyes. "Thank you, Lady Brandt. And Duke Herhardt." Kyle bowed politely. "Let's go, Leyla." It wasn't until Kyle showed a gentle smile when he saw Leyla's face. Through his mellow smile, Claudine could tell. That boy loved Leyla. Leyla looked smaller and thinner next to Kyle, who was as tall as Matthias. The boy seemed to cherish Leyla like a treasure. "What about Leyla?" Claudine carefully examined Leyla with her lightly opened eyes. She was smiling back at Kyle. Leyla Lewellin always smiled in front of Claudine, but it was the first time Claudine had seen her face smiling as comfortable and bright as now. It didn't seem to be unreasonable to say that she looked like a girl in love. "It was the son of the doctor, not Duke Herhardt?" Claudine was in confusion as Leyla and Kyle turned around. "Then was it him that made Leyla Lewellin into a princess?" Leyla. Claudine, who had been pondering, impulsively opened her lips. The chandelier light had shined down upon Leyla. "How pretty you are today. Especially that necklace." "What? Yes. Thank you, miss." The bewildered Leyla fondled her necklace. The long necklace that dangled over Layla's chest suited her well. The edges of the emerald that gave off the same color of her eyes were meticulously crafted into a flower petal. It looked authentic. The same went for the milky white pearls. All the jewels were too delicate and alluring to be regarded as imitations. "Can that Kyle Ettman, the son of the doctor's family, afford to hang such a necklace on Leyla?" "Isn't that right, Duke Herhardt?" Claudine faced Matthias and smiled. "Yes. She does," Matthias answered without a grain of hesitation. He looked undisturbed. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 19. "Kiss me please." Kyle led Leyla to a terrace connected to the rose garden. As the tumultuous and colorful atmosphere of the party faded from a distance, Leyla finally breathed a sigh of relief. "Thanks, Kyle. Thank you so much." Leyla thanked while leaning against the marble railing. She thought Kyle would laugh, but he somehow looked austere. "Kyle, why are you holding it in? Huh? They're dragging you around like a spectacle. Why are you staying still? You're not like the prideful and clever Leyla Lewellin that I know of." "Who cares?" Unlike Kyle, who was unusually furious, Leyla simply smiled. "They're not wrong. I am an orphan, I am indebted to Uncle Bill, and I am planning to become a teacher." "I really don't get you." "People are born two-faced, Mr. Ettman. You're only good at saying useless things." Kyle ended up smiling at Layla's mischievous reply. "Go now, Kyle. I'm really fine." "Go where?" "You have a lot of people to meet here. You also have a lot of friends." "No thanks." Kyle waved his hands as if he was annoyed and leaned his back against the railing along with Leyla. "Don't be like that." "Leyla, I'm here as your partner today." Kyle slowly turned his head. His brown eyes gleamed warmly in the dark. "So I'll be by your side." A smile slowly spread over Kyle's lips. "I want to." The wind carried the sweet rose scent from the garden. Leyla tried to answer back, but all she could do was to grasp the handrail with her lips tightly closed. "Why aren't you answering?" "I'm not sure." "Are you being shy in front of me?" "No way." "Your face looks red." "No." Leyla raised her hands and stroked her cheeks. "Fooled ya." Leyla laughed when she saw Kyle playfully giggling. It was then when Mrs. Edman, who had been searching for her son, found the two on the terrace. "Kyle, what the hell are you doing here?" She approached and let out a deep sigh. Leyla hurriedly straightened her posture and bowed her head. Mrs. Edman accepted her greeting with a frank look and then turned to her son. "There's a lot of people waiting to see you." "You mean my father?" Kyle grinned, but Mrs. Edman's eyes became stern. "Kyle Edman, are my words funny to you?" "Mom, you know that's not what I meant." "Let's go. Madame Norma's waiting for you." "You're not thinking of making her wait, are you?" Mrs. Edman's attitude was obstinate. It was as if she wouldn't allow any further counter-arguments. "See you, Kyle." Leyla carefully opened her mouth after holding her breath. Madame Norma adored the only son of her doctor. Leyla knew how proud Mrs. Edman was. "I'll wait here." Leyla smiled to reassure Kyle. "Thank you, Leyla." Mrs. Edman was, only then, able to smile at Leyla. Her brown eyes that resembled Kyle's had always looked bitter towards Leyla. Leyla knew that as well. Kyle reluctantly took a heavy step. Leyla gave a small wave at Kyle, who kept looking back. "Wait for me," Kyle cried as he grimaced. "You have to wait for me, Leyla." "Okay." She was willing to answer, but Leyla couldn't take her lips off. All she could do was to wave her hands more vigorously. After Kyle and Mrs. Edman left, the terrace was calm again. The music and laughter from the hall mingled with the beautiful lights, creating a relaxed atmosphere. Leyla had left her glasses at home so the lights looked blurry, but the scenery looked more dreamy with her blurry vision. Now Leyla Lewellin's role was over. Leyla was able to relax. With her relaxed state, her unfamiliar clothes came into view. When she slightly moved her legs, the waist-decorated ribbon in the bottom of her dress shook. Leyla started becoming jolly as she tiptoed up and down while looking down at the rich hem of the flowing dress. The white dress embroidered with the gold thread was as majestic as the dreamy night. The dress's texture that brushed against Leyla's skin was so soft that her entire body was ticklish. "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." "And the necklace." Leyla gently fondled her necklace as she lost her shy smile. Why did Lady Brandt say that? Leyla guessed that Claudine was probably expressing contempt and sympathy in a sophisticated way, but Leyla didn't mind. Uncle Bill's gift was dazzlingly beautiful. No matter what others said, Leyla was content with her gift. Leyla smiled again, and when she raised her head, a tall man came out onto the terrace. Leyla believed it was Kyle and had gotten excited, but when she recognized who the man was, she froze. Plus, it was Duke Herhardt, along with Lady Brandt. "It's very clear at night, isn't it?" Claudine asked as she took a deep breath. Her behavior seemed like she had led Matthias to the terrace because of the night breeze. "I like the summer because its nights are pleasing. What about you, Duke Herhardt?" Claudine smiled brightly as she stood in front of the marble railing. Her gaze had left Matthias's face and went towards Leyla Lewellin, who was standing at the far opposite end of the terrace. Leyla was the primary reason Claudine had brought Matthias here. "I don't like summer very much, my lady." Matthias stood beside Claudine. His eyes that were looking at the rose-filled garden then briefly passed by Leyla's face. She looked very embarrassed and nervous at the appearance of unexpected guests. "Really? I thought you liked summer." Claudine now looked at Matthias with her back against Leyla. "Come to think of it, I feel like Duke Herhardt is a heartless man." "Of course, you know that's not a reproach, right?" Claudine, with her hands held together behind her back, came a step closer. The distance between the two was close enough to reach each other's breath. "I actually like your insensitivity. I think it accentuates your nobility and elegant manner." "I'm glad to hear that." Matthias didn't back down and faced Claudine. "Kiss me, please," Claudine demanded boldly. Matthias stared at her in silence. "I like the heartless Duke Herhardt, but don't we still need to put in some passion or enthusiasm? As Claudine tilted her head, the thickly curled brown hair shook elastically. I mean, we are getting engaged, married, and will live together for the rest of our lives. Minimal passion. Matthias narrowed his eyes for a while and gave a nod to agree. Indeed. Matthias rapped Claudine's cheek without much hesitation. Claudine looked a little surprised, but she soon naturally closed her eyes. While looking at the shadows of Claudine's eyelashes, Matthias's gaze unconsciously turned to the opposite end of the terrace. The fidgeting Leyla had met eyes with him just in time. Leaving his gaze of Leyla intact, Matthias lowered his lips over Claudine's lips. The spectator Leyla Lewellin that Claudine wanted was faithful to her role. Frozen in place, Leyla blankly watched the two. Even the darkness and the long distance couldn't hide Layla's red cheeks. Throughout the very restrained kiss, Matthias's eyes had continued to be on Leyla. Her green eyes helplessly looked at him in a paralyzed state. Although the moon was bright, her eyes looked as dull as the night. When Leyla avoided his eyes, the two people's blunt kiss was over. Leyla ran down the stairs leading to the garden while Claudine slowly opened her eyes and oddly smiled. Let's go. Matthias politely reached out his hand. Claudine held the hand as if nothing had happened. I'm sure, Duke Herhardt. Claudine, who had just entered the hall, grinned. I'm sure that we'll become a pretty good couple. Leyla frantically ran down the stairs. She knew she wasn't being chased, but Leyla kept running faster. The sound of Layla's shoes on the promenade shook the serene garden of the night. It wasn't until she reached the massive fountain in the middle of the garden when Leyla finally stopped. She didn't realize the pain in her feet because all she could think of was escaping the terrace. Leyla slightly took off her shoes and winced. There were raw scratches all over her feet, which suffered from the new pumps. Her heel was skinned and blood flowed down. All she wanted to do was to run to the cabin, but she eventually turned around. She promised Kyle that she'll be waiting. Leyla believed she had to at least tell him that she was making her leave first. But she was afraid to go back to that mansion, to that strange and uncomfortable world. Leyla agonized as she limped along the right side of the path. She stood under the vine roses where the pergola stood. She was planning to first wait in the garden and then visit the mansion when Kyle was about to come back. Can I sit down? Leyla stared at the bench and wondered. It was the rose vine Uncle Bill pruned with special care, but she had never gone under it. It was a seat not allowed by any other residents or servants. But wouldn't it be okay today since I'm here as Arvis's guest? After more thoughts, Leyla was able to quietly sit at the end of the bench. She needed a little more time and courage to then take off her shoes. Leyla leaned her back against the armrest of the bench and wrapped her knees in her arms. The throbbing feet touched the cold marble and the pain started to subside a little. She now learned how good-looking shoes wore out her feet, so she couldn't bear to wear the shoes again. If I hadn't ran, I could have at least saved my heels. Leyla gently grazed the painful wound with her fingertips. She shook her head to shake off the sudden memory. When she thought of the man who stared at her while kissing his fiancée, Leyla frowned. Leyla didn't understand why Claudine had casually accepted the kiss even though she knew there was a person there. Why are they like that? Mumbling to herself, Leyla unwittingly rubbed her lips. So shameless. This time, she rubbed the inside of her lips with the back of hand. It was as if to erase the memory and the strange feeling of that night when the moon was lit. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 20. How kind of you, Madam. Mrs. Edmund's eyes, looking at Madame Norma, were full of heartfelt admiration. How can you show such great kindness? The clearer the joy spread on Mrs. Edmund's face, the more troubled Kyle Edmund looked as he stood beside her. Matthias watched the two with an interested glance. He knew that his grandmother liked her doctor and adored his son. Dr. Edmund was a competent doctor and had excellent character, so it was reasonable. Maybe Kyle Edmund, who resembles his father, will live that same life as long as there is no change. Grandmother was sure of it, and Matthias agreed. But that was it. There was no reason for Matthias to pay any more attention to the obvious and tedious facts. Linda Edmund, the very ambitious lady of the house, acted differently from the two men of the Edmonds family. May I greet them now? Fearing that Norma might change her mind, Mrs. Edmond lost her composure and pressured Norma. Dear Dr. Edmond, who had been quietly watching, gently dissuaded her, but she didn't seem to be willing to give up at all. Matthias turned to Kyle Edmond again. His grandmother had offered to introduce Baron Arendt's family to the Edmond family. There wasn't anyone who didn't know the hidden meaning behind her words when Norma said the two families would match well so they could be good acquaintances. Baron Arendt had a daughter who was around the same age as Kyle Edmond. A daughter who was at the age to start thinking about getting married. Even though the Edmond household had no title of nobility, they were wealthier than the Arendt household. They also had greater prestige. If the two families became in-laws, it was Baron Arendt who benefited the most. Yes, Mrs. Edmond. That sounds good. Norma Katerina von Herhardt called in her servant with a generous smile. She had ordered to bring in Baron Arendt and his wife. The servant quickly disappeared through the crowd. Kyle's face, glancing towards the terrace that connected the garden, was now indescribably nervous. It was as if he had left behind something precious there. A smile flashed on Matthias's lips as he was sure of what that was. A mother who had an infinite attachment and expectation for her son, and a son who didn't know how to disappoint her. When Matthias thought of Leyla Lewellin in between the two, he almost chuckled. In the meantime, Baron Arendt and his wife, who were guided by the servant, appeared. Their daughter was with them. Of course. Kyle seemed to have noticed the meaning of the occasion. Even though he had a look of immediate desire to run out, the boy couldn't let go of the role of a good and polite son. If that was the case, Matthias left the stage of the boring matchmaking scene. His gait across the terrace and down the stairs was relaxed without the slightest sign of impatience. It was obvious what kind of ending the dutiful son's puppy love would come to. Leyla was ultimately going to be abandoned and left in Matthias's woods. By the time the obvious conclusion was reached, Matthias found Leyla. She was staying underneath the pergola in the corner of the garden, not bothering to go far because she had promised to wait for the boy. Matthias moved towards her at a slower pace. He was wondering why she didn't become flustered as usual, but he then realized that she was fast asleep. The faint moonlight that traveled through the rose bushes shone on the small, crouching woman. Matthias stopped at a short distance from the bench and deeply looked at her neatly taken off shoes, wounded feet, slender arms wrapped around her knees, and her face that looked more innocent when asleep. A long stretch of hair wrapped around her thin neck and shoulders. Matthias gently lowered his waist and picked up her shoes as he wondered how soft her golden locks would feel. It was then when Leyla slowly opened her eyes. It's a dream, Leyla vaguely thought. In the meantime, Matthias stood against the pillar of the pergola that faced the bench. In his hand, there were shoes that looked like a woman's. But even if this is a dream, isn't it too strange? When the question came to mind, the lingering feeling of sleep receded. The Duke? Leyla couldn't believe what was seeing, so she had whispered to him. Instead of answering, Matthias took out a cigarette and held it to his mouth. The white smoke of his lips streaming out of his mouth proved that this moment could never be a dream. Leyla, who was about to faint in surprise, belatedly realized that the shoes he held in his hand was hers. Leyla crouched her body to the edge of the bench. Matthias stared at her as if he was amused and slowly waved her shoes. Do you want it back? A low voice came along with the hazy cigarette smoke. Yes. Then cry, Leyla. The following words were even more languid and appalling. His unbelievable words stunned Leyla. She hoped that Kyle would come quickly, but the road beyond the pergola was empty. He's not coming. The Duke spoke calmly as if he had read her mind. Kyle Edmond, Matthias whispered as he looked at Leyla, frowning in doubt. The one you're waiting for. Matthias dropped the half-smoked cigarette onto the ground. When the thinly rising smoke stopped, Leyla looked up in tears. No. Leyla pulled herself up as she was determined to not show her wounded feet. She faced Matthias with both her feet strongly placed on the floor. Although she was still afraid of him, she didn't want to become his amusement anymore. Kyle always keeps his word. Does he? Yes, Leyla replied with conviction. You look quite confident. I think I know more about Kyle than you do, Leyla clearly and emphatically said, mustering up all the courage she had. A smile spread over the Duke's lips. Confidence isn't something to be reckoned with, Leyla. The Duke approached along with his words. Although her shoulders cowered in fear, Leyla didn't back down. I really don't know. About what? Why do you hate me so much? Layla's eyes were direct and lucid, unlike her trembling voice. I feel pleasant when I hate you, he calmly answered with one corner of his mouth raised. It's enjoyable when you cry, and it's fun to see you beg. How can you say that? Leyla, I'm just answering your question. Matthias simply looked nonchalant with the astonished Leyla in front of his eyes. You don't act like this to anyone other than me. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. His insults had brought tears to her eyes, but Leyla managed to put up with it. Matthias willingly nodded to her words. Right. Then why is it only me? Because it's you. What? Because it's you, Leyla. Because you're a nobody. His reply was calm and dry. His tone had made Leyla even more miserable. I'm sorry, Your Grace. Leyla stared at him as she tried not to cry. She started to miss the relatives who had kicked her out for various reasons. Not even her drunk uncle was that cruel to Leyla. I'm so sorry that I'm a nobody that dares to stay in your territory. Now, not only her voice but also her hands that were clenched into fists trembled. If you were going to act like this, why didn't you just disallow me to stay in your estate instead? Leyla, isn't that too unsympathetic? You're truly unsympathetic enough. No matter how hard Leyla had tried to hide it, her voice continued to whimper. Are you going to kick me out now? No. Matthias's eyes grew darker. Don't worry about that. You're doing enough for your use. You said I was a nobody. That's your use. When she slowly opened her closed eyes, Matthias erased the scorn that used to remain at the end of his lips. His expressionless face now looked stiflingly cold and still. That's enough of an apology. Matthias raised his head, which had been leaning deeply towards Leyla, and stood in a straight posture. The Kailetman you are waiting for is not coming. Matthias's hand pointing to an empty path touched Layla's hair that flowed over her shoulder. Leyla backed away in fear, but was blocked by the bench and couldn't take a step further. So Leyla, with her golden hair grasped and fondled by Matthias, he looked at Leyla with a deeper look than before. Cry. Even at the moment he gave a heartless order, Matthias remained calm. Even better if you beg. With the addition of his suggestion, Matthias's lips had formed into a faint smile. Crazy person. Leyla had been thinking that for a long time, but she was sure now. This man was definitely crazy. When Matthias had returned to his mansion, Kailetman was still held up by his mother. The Baron and Baroness Arendt seemed to like the idea of becoming in-laws with the Edman household. They showed considerable favor and Mrs. Edman's response was not much different. Kyle's attitude was now noticeably stiff, but his mother didn't seem to care much about her son. Matthias once again drew away his attention from the obvious and tedious affairs. Mixed between familiar faces, he began to play the role of the master of Arvis, Duke Herhardt. Leyla cried. Matthias felt satisfied while recalling the moment. She trembled and droplets of water fell from her face as she couldn't hold in her rage. Her wet eyes looked more clear because of the corners of her eyes that had turned red. At the moment, Leyla Lewellin's eyes sparkled like the jewels that hung around her neck, and Matthias liked that. He returned her shoes because she cried beautifully. When he was about to leave the garden, he looked back and saw Leyla still standing there crying. She cried because of him, therefore, the tears that came from Leyla's was his. Matthias's steps became lighter. His despondent feeling of when he saw Kailetman escorting Leyla into the mansion was washed away with Layla's tears. As well as the indescribable feeling he felt the moment he kissed Claudine while staring at Leyla. Tonight, in his world, Leyla was beautiful, and the beautiful Leyla had cried in front of him. So it was a perfect summer night. By the time Matthias reached that satisfactory conclusion, Leyla unexpectedly reappeared. Standing on the edge of the aisle linking the hall to the terrace, she was carefully looking for someone. Kailetman. Matthias slowly whispered the name. Leyla seemed to have found him soon. However, she wasn't able to approach. She seemed to have understood what it meant for Kailetman to be surrounded by the errant household, especially Baron Arendt's youngest daughter. Leyla, who had been hiding behind the post for a long time, approached the passing servant and had said something to him. The servant nodded his head and started to head towards Kyletman, who had a cold look on his face as if he had reached his limit. Meanwhile, Leyla had left the terrace. Matthias impulsively approached the servant. "Please call Count Klein." The eyes of the servant grew bigger at Matthias's order. For a moment, he glanced over to Kyletman's side, but gave the very answer Matthias expected. "Yes, master." Turning his steps, he hurried through the crowd to accept Matthias's order. Matthias left the terrace and leaned on the pillar where Leyla had stayed a while ago. Leyla was drifting absently along the promenade and then to the center of the garden. Her feet seemed to hurt as she limped. She later took off her shoes and walked barefoot from the middle of the path. Matthias watched her as he waited for his servant. Of course, Count Klein wasn't going to come. Having a neurotic headache, the Count had only shown his face early in the evening and returned home. By the time Leyla disappeared deep into the forest, the servant from before had approached. "I'm sorry, master. Count Klein had already returned home." "I see." Matthias nodded and smiled. "Well done." Matthias leisurely left the terrace after his salute. Only then did the servant return to his previous duty. As he approached Kyletman, he delivered Leyla's words and a sense of dismay flashed across Kyletman's face. Kyle suddenly began to rush out to the terrace after asking for his understanding, but Matthias didn't mind any longer. Leyla Lewellin, despite her little figure, walked pretty fast. It was too late for Kyle to catch up to her. Matthias willingly took the glass of champagne Riette had offered. The glamorous midsummer night, the party was perfect. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 21. Time to become an adult. "I don't know if I can leave you here alone." Bill sighed with a worrisome face. "Uncle, you'll really miss the train at this rate," Leyla kindly urged him. Bill was reassured at her confidence in being home alone, but he somehow felt a little sentimental. An obituary was delivered to the cabin yesterday afternoon. Bill's brother had passed away. Even though the two brothers weren't close and hadn't seen each other for a long time, Bill couldn't ignore the fact that his brother used to be the only family left in the world. Bill eventually decided to take a few days off and travel to his hometown. Going there was not a problem for Bill, but leaving the little Leyla alone made his heart feel as heavy as lead. "You have to make sure to keep the door shut. Even if it's hot, keep the windows closed." Bill repeated his words of advice several times since last night. "The hunting gun is hanging in my room. I'll make sure to lock the door, the windows, and move the hunting gun that's in your room next to my bed. If a bad person shows up, I'll shoot them." Leyla calmly recited the words she had heard so many times. "I'll eat well, sleep well, and stay well." He would only be gone for 3 days at most, but Bill worried about Leyla as if he was going to be away for months. Bill reluctantly took off, even though he still had a concerned look. Leyla followed him to the entrance of the mansion to see him off. "Leyla, did something happen at the party that day?" Bill carefully asked after taking a glimpse of the magnificent mansion building. "No, I had fun. There weren't any trouble." "I'm serious." "I'm glad you did. But somehow, you seem to be distancing yourself from Kyle after that party." "Me? Kyle?" Leyla laughed as if it was nonsense. "No way. It's just that we've been busy these days." "Can I take your word for it?" "Yes. Why would I tell such a lie?" "That's true. There's no way your relationship with Kyle would get awkward." "Then Leyla, if you're too scared to be alone, then bring Kyle." "No, no. Pretend you didn't hear." Bill shook his hand with a serious look. "He's the most dangerous. Uncle. If he comes over, make sure to send him back before sunset. Keep in mind." "Stop saying strange things now, go ahead." Leyla comforted Bill's back with a warm touch. Bill looked back several times and repeated his advice as he moved further away on the other side of the Platanus Road. Leyla stayed there for a while until Bill was no longer in sight. Every time he turned around, Leyla smiled and waved her hands. She believed the next 3 days were going to be very long. Layla's avoiding me. Kyle was sure now. I think it's because of the party that day. The reason wasn't that difficult to find. You think so too? Phoebe? Kyle seriously asked, but Phoebe sat on the window frame pecking at the oats and pretended not to hear. Kyle deeply sighed when he found himself talking nonsense to the dove. Phoebe brought Layla's note again today with disappointing news. The note read that Uncle Bill was going to be at his hometown for a few days and Layla was planning to be at the library all day long, so the cabin was going to be empty. He's been getting these types of messages for days lately. Her note said she was planning to go to another friend's house. She had an appointment downtown. She was busy helping Bill with the orchards. At first, he thought it was her consideration of notifying him instead of having him come into the cabin in vain when it was actually empty. But at this point, it all seemed like excuses. Clumsy excuses to avoid Kyle Edman. I don't blame her. I would do the same. Kyle clutched his head and gave a deep sigh. He proudly declared that he was her partner and promised he would protect her. Yet, he had left Layla alone. After hearing the servant's words that Layla left him, he ran out of the hall, but she had already taken her leave. He didn't know why he couldn't get out of there sooner. Even though he had told her to wait. He made her wait. He failed to keep his promise. Kyle nervously wandered around the room while Phoebe, who ate its fill, left. Kyle stared into the direction where the dove flew away and impulsively stormed out the room. He couldn't remember how he got on his bike and pedaled. He thought of Layla as he went out of breath. By the time his heart was about to burst at the thought of Layla, Kyle had arrived at the cabin in the Arvis estate. His shoulders moved up and down as he tried to catch his breath in the scorching sun. There were white sheets and pillowcases dripping with water on the clothesline at the yard. And beyond it, there was a shadow of a woman with a soft, thin body line. Feeling both relief and despondency, Kyle slowly swept his sweaty hair behind his forehead. Layla gently showed her face over the sheets as if she had felt his presence. Her green eyes grew round when she met eyes with him. Kyle. The sweet voice that came through her lips was enough to make him forget this embarrassing situation. I'm sorry. Kyle, who had been sitting in front of the table, remained silent for a long time and then sighed. Layla sat on the opposite side. When she was looking down at her fingertips, she had suddenly raised her eyes at Kyle's apology. I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. No. Don't. Layla shook her head after being taken aback. I'm the one who's sorry. I'm sorry I lied about not being at home. No, it's because of me. It's all my fault. It's not like that. I'm not upset or mad at you. I'm serious, Kyle. Then is there another reason? Why? You're avoiding me. You know, Kyle, I like you as a friend. You're kind of like my family. So I think we should further ourselves now. Layla attempted to pull up the corners of her lip to calmly smile, but Kyle didn't seem to notice. Layla was sincere when she said she wasn't upset or angry at Kyle. But that night, at that dreamy party, Layla saw a clear line. A line drawn between Kyle and herself that she couldn't cross just because they were friends. She had already thought that she wasn't enough to be hanging out with the son of a brilliant household. But the gap between her vague thoughts and the sight of reality was painfully cruel. The heir to a widely respected family of doctors who can easily mingle with the aristocrats. The Kyle Edman that Layla saw on that day at the Duke's dazzling banquet hall, was a man who lived in a world beyond that definite line. Kyle Edman could no longer be the child who used to play with Layla. Why should a child grow up and become an adult? That night, as Layla walked along the dark forest path with her shoes in her hands, she brooded on that transparent, sad question. And then she decided to accept time. And to accept the only way she could protect her precious friend, even in that passing time. You know you're talking nonsense, right? Kyle opened his lips after a long time. His voice was lower and calmer than usual. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. No. I mean it. You like me, but why should we be apart? That way, we can be good friends for a long time. Kyle, I don't want to lose you. You think I'd want to lose you? Kyle's eyes shook as he looked at Leyla. How can we, not anyone else, be apart? That's impossible, Leyla. Kyle, I'll never lose you. I won't even go further away from you. How can you say that? Kyle set down the glass cup and clenched his fist with all his might. You can't do that, Kyle. Instead of saying what she wanted to say, Leyla smiled. It's time to become an adult. Leyla stood up while swallowing the thorn-like words. Let's have lunch, Kyle. Leyla hurriedly fastened the apron she had taken off earlier ago. As an apology for lying, I'll make you a very delicious lunch. Matthias, can't you just discharge from the military and concentrate on your family's work now? Riet lay down on the sofa as he put down the newspaper he scanned over. As he turned his head while yawning, he saw Matthias sitting on the wing chair reading a book. It's not that bad spending a couple of years in the military division. Matthias gave a leisurely reply as he turned the page. Even on this hot summer afternoon, he wore a jacket and a tie in his bedroom. Well, that's the tradition of the Herhardt family, all right, Riet murmured while languidly stretching. Matthias von Herhardt will be the most perfect Duke of Arvis, better than any other predecessors. While Riet chuckled, the canary, who was playing well in the cage, suddenly spread its wings. The bird lightly flew and landed on the book that Matthias was reading. A soft smile came upon Matthias's face as he stared at the chattering bird. It was quite an astounding scene for Riet, who had seen Matthias shoot and kill birds without batting an eye in the hunting grounds for years. I hope that bird is a she, Matthias. Riet shook his head as he lost his breath. If it's not, I think I'll be grossed out. Matthias reached his hand out to the bird without a reply. The little bird tilted its head from one side to another and then started to gently rub its beak at the tip of his finger. Don't you think so, Claudine? Riet turned to Claudine, who was sitting right across from Matthias and Riet. She looked at Matthias and his bird with an embroidery on her hands. When she met eyes with Riet, a faint smile spread over her expressionless face. I heard that birds with beautiful voices are usually male. Please, Claudine. Let's just believe it's a female. Riet jokingly shuddered. It's creepy to think they're interacting like that if they're both male. What's wrong with that? It's just a bird. Claudine laughed and grabbed the needle to start her embroidery again. Matthias turned a page only after the bird that was bouncing on his book moved. He looked unconcerned even when the bird distractedly flew around tapping his hands, shoulders, and head. You should wear a light yellow dress at the engagement party, Claudine. Duke Herhardt might love you like that bird. No, Claudine answered back without a delay. I hate yellow. After taking a deep breath, she continued to stitch. It's somewhat vulgar. Her words were accompanied by a little scoff. A strange smile came upon Riet's lips. At that point, he stopped talking about the bird and began to rattle on about Matthias's military service and the engagement ceremony that was just around the corner. Our little lady Claudine will soon be the lady that beat the royal princess. I'm ashamed of that kind of flattery, Riet. Although her eyes frowned, Claudine brightly smiled. It was an open truth that the Berg Emperor coveted Duke Herhardt as his son-in-law. The Emperor's love for his youngest daughter was extreme. Moreover, she was a beautiful lady who was called the flower of the socialites. Claudine, who had taken the position of Duchess Arvis for granted since childhood, felt a sense of crisis because of the princess. But in the end, Claudine won. Of course, she didn't win because of love. Matthias doesn't need to. The Herhardt's response to the reason for not becoming in-laws with the imperial family was summed up in that brief remark. Herhardt was a household with history, wealth, and honor that were no less than the emperor's. It wasn't unreasonable to judge that the hassle of serving the princess was greater than the benefit of having her as a duchess. Such arrogance was understood when placed before the Herhardt's name. Thanks to that, Claudine Brandt became a lady who beat the emperor's daughter. It was obvious why the Herhardt family chose her. She was the only daughter of a reputable count who didn't have a successor. So the Herhardt family judged Claudine to be a bride with a good pedigree and dowry no less than the princess. They also didn't have to serve Claudine, unlike the royal princess. When the engagement ceremony was held, Claudine Brandt's name was expected to be placed in a higher position than the emperor's daughter. The thought made Claudine feel like she could love everything in this world, including that vulgar little bird. I can't believe your engagement is just around the corner. It makes me feel all strange. Riet sat up and stretched his arms. Claudine, who had been calmly looking at Riet, began to casually stitch again. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 22. Matthias had made a wrong decision by turning around. He was planning to stay in the annex before dinner time to finish his pile of work. In hindsight, nothing had changed in his plan. At least until he left the annex. Matters were thrown into disarray after he twisted his body to look behind and found himself standing on the road leading to the gardener's cottage. Matthias halted, pausing in his footsteps with a pensive look on his face. The days had marched on as they should. Everything went off without a hitch and in an orderly fashion. Her tears on that night had also been washed away and cleaned off all traces of his foreign feeling. Matthias expanded his stride and strolled through the shady forest path. He tugged at his tie and loosened it, then pushed open a few buttons on his tight-fitting shirt. His gestures were a bit rougher, and he wasn't as calm as he always was. It was sickening. He loathed these emotions that were out of his track. It was aggravating for him to be plagued with feelings he couldn't curb. Matthias wanted everything in his world to be in its place. So did his own feelings. That's the reason why he had never been enamored of the creature called a woman. In his orbit, the lust for sex was simply an instinct. He had never dwelled on it or been swayed by it. Rather, it was cumbersome, nothing more than a need to be adequately satisfied and dried away. Such desires, to begin with, didn't rule the roost in his mind. That's how the annoyance and discomfort he felt because of Leyla grew and wreaked havoc on his stable world. Only she now could be in his world. His whole five senses were fixed on her and blinding passion welled up deep inside him uncontrollably. There were often times when his gluttonous desire and lustful thoughts to possess her became too much for him to handle. Matthias was displeased as he learned he was obsessed with such trivial things. He couldn't even put it on his list of priorities. Leyla Lewellin was a good-for-nothing who belonged to that league. Still, he needed to make sure. The long line of the forest trees gradually petered out as the cottage building grew closer. Pondering, Matthias walked into the blanket of light. The jolly beam of summer sunlight was drifting down, permeating his eyes through the slats of twigs. Leyla had found a baby bird sprawled on the ground. She was traveling home after sending Kyle off when she suddenly heard the sound of a helpless squeal. Leyla spotted a fallen baby bird under a tree in the backyard. A tiny, fragile nestling that had just recently had its feathers begin to grow. "Oh, did you fall?" Leyla wrapped the baby bird with a careful touch and raised her eyes, looking up at the tree. Precisely as she had thought, there was a bird's nest sighted in one of the tree's limbs. The tree loomed quite high, but thankfully, the baby bird wasn't severely injured. "It's okay. I'll take you home." Leyla petted the baby bird gently and tucked it into her apron's pocket. She hurried back to the cottage to take the ladder stashing in the warehouse. She securely leaned the ladder against the tree and started climbing up. The nest was nestled between branches higher than the ladder, so she had no choice but to clamber further. Climbing that high usually had never been a problem for her. But with the baby bird in her pocket, Leyla became more circumspect in her movements and couldn't be as nimble as usual. After ascending the closest bough to the bird's nest, Leyla snatched the branch with one hand and thrust the other into her pocket. She painstakingly stretched her arms as far as she could and safely handed back the baby bird to its nest. Too bad, just as she breathed a sigh of relief, her foot suddenly slipped off, and she lost her grip on the branch. The world spun upside down in a split second as her body bounced and lost its balance. She had managed to grab the branch's end and hold it tight, but the ladder had dropped to the ground. Alas, the branch that was too weak to support her body weight started making a crackling sound. "Uncle! Uncle Bill!" The terrified Leyla reflexively screamed aloud. But her shout was met by the silence that she realized Uncle Bill wasn't at home. "Kylie!" Though she knew Kyle had walked too far and couldn't hear it, Leyla kept crying and calling out to him. Kyle was her only hope when Uncle Bill wasn't here. Because they were the only ones who would come to help her when she was in trouble. Leyla. Suddenly, A familiar voice appeared out of nowhere. The mellow voice called out her name softly as if singing a song. Her mind had turned white with fear, but Leyla could still recognize the owner of the voice. She lowered her frightened gaze, and someone she knew was standing right below her. Duke Herhardt. With an unbothered state, his eyes straight at the fallen ladder, and calmly watched her hanging precariously on the half-broken tree branch. He laughed, asking her, "Shall I save you?" "That crazy person, why does he?" "No need." Even amidst her fear, Leyla flatly refused his offer of help. She persisted in holding onto the tree branch, though she knew her tries were fruitless. The branch began to shake even more, showing how rickety it was quickly becoming as the crack became deeper. "Kyle! Kylie!" Her cries mingled with fright, calling for Kyle reverberated through the Arvis forest. Matthias giggled at a peak. He turned to look down the path that the young man had gone. "He's not coming," he said, and relaxedly folded his arms. "No matter how heartless he is, doesn't he feel the least bit concerned when he sees people in danger?" Leyla soon understood that astounding fact about the person standing before her. He was Duke of Herhardt. That insane Duke wouldn't be able to have a reasonable mind like a normal person. "Go away," she snapped at him in annoyance, and shooed him away. "If you're not willing to help, just go. Why are you still standing there? It seems you're gonna fall. I'll call someone to save you." "What did you say?" "I'm not such a heartless person, Leyla." Matthias's lips curved into a drowsy grin. "I'll call Mr. Etman, whom you were calling desperately." "You dipshit." His voice could no longer be heard as the noise of her panting breath had drowned it out. "Well, let me see, what am I gonna do? Looking at the height, I think it's better to call Dr. Etman instead." "God damn it." Leyla felt she had every reason for mowing him down with a hail of the most virulent cusses, if only her position right now didn't hinder her from doing so. Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site. Thanks, save me. Leyla wailed in despair. Rather than begging the man in front of her, she would rather crumble to the ground and be wounded. That's all she thought before her fear compelled her to forego her principles. "Are you sure?" Matthias asked, leisurely taking off his coat. "Call me, then." "What?" "Call me." He took a few steps closer to the tree before coming to a stop and staring longingly at her, as if he were waiting for the moment of her fall if his demand would not be met. Leyla freaking knew it, that he was a man capable of those deeds. "Duke, please." Leyla begged him with teary eyes and her voice miserably sobbing. "Duke." Her plea grew more despondent as the moment for her fall drew nearer. After she hailed him for the millionth time, the branch ended up broken. She fell. Layla's mind went blank. Her vision became hazy as her body floated down from the tree. "Then he cometh." Matthias ran hell for leather towards the tree and embraced her deeply in his arms. Their bodies bumped onto the ground, but Matthias refused to let go, and kept hugging her with all his might. The dirt and dust broom clouding them colliding on the soil gradually dissipated. Layla's head was buzzing, but slowly she got her consciousness back. Soft. It felt pillowy and unbelievably cozy even though she had fallen from an elevated place. Leyla opened her eyes. The warmth she felt belonged to a man, whom she had unknowingly hugged tightly. Duke Herhardt lay underneath her, and she was blanketed safe and sound in his arms. She could feel the sound of his beating heart transmitted to her chest that were intimately in touch with each other. His arm muscles wounded around her waist and the back of her head stoutly, were incredibly strong. As she slowly raised her head, a faint minty scent of water could be smelled from the nape of his neck. His skin was smooth and warm, and mantled with a wonderful fragrance. The heat, which had started from her cheek, quickly dispersed throughout her body in no time. It gave Leyla a startled shudder when her body started to reheat. She wrestled her hardest to escape from him, glossing over the shame as their bodies were entwined in a close knot. He was too big and too hefty. Matthias' bondage had only got him stronger the harder she tried to secede. "SSST, stay still," Matthias ordered her with a low sigh. But Layla's resistance grew fiercer. No. She was fed up. Her blood was boiling. "What a jerk. I don't want to." Leyla tried to scream, but she didn't get a single word in. Matthias's choking embrace, which was trapping her, meanwhile became growingly hot. His head and waist hugging her were ever mightier. All of those strange yet unfamiliar sensations were getting AWOL to her, and Leyla couldn't take it any longer. She was scared shitless and desperately tried to break free. But the more she wanted to resist, the more helpless she felt. Whatever she did, Leyla couldn't push herself off of him. The moment her delusion soon coalesced with her worst dread, without heed of, she blindly bit the Duke's ear. Matthias grimaced in pain and straight off shoved her backward. He was dumbfounded, but soon, his mouth twisted in a pucker of amusement. Matthias found it hilarious watching her trembling so badly when she was the one who had savagely assaulted him. Leyla's vivid green eyes glared at him ferociously, acting as she wanted to rip him into pieces. Matthias stopped laughing. "Be a lady, Leyla." Matthias lightly caressed his bitten ear, immediately grabbed Leyla by the hair without batting an eye. Without reflexes, she had been pushed to the ground. Matthias' visage loomed above her, glowering at her with his void-slitted eyes. "So this is what I get in return after saving your life? Don't you think it's too unladylike?" "Why should I be ladylike when you're not even a gentleman?" Leyla turned her face aside. Embarrassment was splotching her cheeks with red color as she tried to push his body one more time. But Matthias had snatched her chin with his scorching hot hand and dragged her face to his. "Didn't your mouth just say I was a gentleman?" "No. I misspoke." "Did you? A gentleman, huh? It's hogwash. If you're a gentleman, how can you do this?" Leyla stammered with a face that was going to break into tears and struggled to get away from him. Matthias's eyes narrowed. A small furrow formed between his eyebrows as he looked at Leyla, rubbing her lips as if they had been polluted with something filthy. "Please step aside." Leyla glared at him with a sullen look invading her face. "Something like this, arg." A shrill scream came out, letting the last syllable hang in the air. Matthias had lowered his head and bit back her ear. All happened in a snap, almost unexpectedly. With a relentless thud, Matthias slammed her onto the earth. He gripped her clawing little hand, hindered her move, and roughed up her ear. Her shrieking breath fell when Matthias began to suck and nibble on her lobe. Matthias initially planned to repay what she had granted him, but he had changed his mind and pushed her with a tenacious force. Leyla groaned and twisted her body when he bit her clammy earlobe hard. The sound of sobbing and gasping was muggy and oven-like. Matthias' weight pressed her flailing limbs and branded his teeth mark all over her reddish ears. A satisfied smile presented on his face after he saw Leyla's messy countenance. Her innocent eyes were soggy, transparently swollen with tears. Her slightly open lips, which were even darker than its hackneyed shade, gulped in a lungful of heavy air. Matthias tightly clutched her crumbly intertwined fingers and sensuously devoured her moist lips. Astonished by his sudden kiss, Leyla firmly clenched her lips, but Matthias had easily dispatched her resistance. This sweltering summer would end by soon enough. Matthias perfectly got the picture. Still, it didn't stop him. He kept shoving his hasty tongue in, sucked it up, and swallowed it as if he meant to engulf her. Pellucid saliva, moaning voice, and rough breathing began to flow through their overlapping lips. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 23. Whenever Leyla struggled, Matthias increased the strength of his hold and Leyla desperately resisted as he did so. What was plastered over her sight every time she opened her tightly closed eyes was only a fickle scene. The shaking leaves, the unfolding sky, and Matthias. The dirty floor, wherein the leaves' silhouettes flickered over it, and him again. The yellowish dust clumped onto and canopied them in a sandy shroud. Their passionate kissing came perilously close to a brawl. At some point, Leyla didn't even know what she was up to. The fear of not breathing and the necessity of needing to do so were grouped into one. On the flip side, the Duke's attempt to suck her lips and tangle her tongue with his only seemed to flare more. Leyla had no choice but to resign herself defeatedly as if she were a living prey that had been consumed by a predator. Her breath became weak and thready at the brachial. She cried out in heartbreak when Matthias' desirous lips started to travel her scruff quickly and strongly. A flurry of buttons scattered as he tore off her blouse, revealing her slender clavicle. His lips persistently provoked one specific spot on her neck where her pulse was beating. His hand that had fondled her thighs and waist, tardily made its way up and grappled her luscious bosoms. Ah! Leyla shook her head hard and yanked on Matthias' shirt. The ripped button on his shirt bounced on the ground. She scratched his skin with her sharp nails, stamping red streaks on his neck several times. The red hickey engraved by Matthias' lips one by one began to garnish her clavicle. Tears sprung to her eyes as his lips began to trail down her collarbone. Leyla's mind went numb. Matthias's body heat, which came into contact with hers, did give her a discombobulation and novel feeling. She was afraid and baffled as to why she had to go through this nightmare. Matthias, thankfully, was able to put a stop to his deeds. He bowed his head and glanced down at her, one arm supporting his body. Leyla opened her eyes. Matthias' gasp was still erratically rough, but his eyes didn't seem to be those of a man engrossed in lust. His eyes were deep and serene, akin to the day he stopped on a coin or the moment he calmly shot a bird to death. The way he looked at her made Layla's face flush in indignation. Matthias placed his stare on her for a few seconds. He drew his eyes closed and slowly opened them. The wriggling of his Adam's apple had ceased as he got a grip on his breathing a little. The forest wind randomly fluttered Layla's hair into a complete mess. The smooth golden waves hovered in front of him as he lowered his gaze. Matthias wiped off the dirt from his hands, then twisted his body to the side. He carefully took in his surroundings. A woman who was lying under the shade of a tree and sobbing. A yard with a clothesline loaded with freshly dried laundry. The old cottage that stood alone. And he who was seated in this ludicrous world with a screwed-up appearance. Matthias scoffed faintly and swept his drooping hair off his forehead. Beside him, Leyla curled up her body in a circle, trying to suck in more air. PFFT, ha, ha. Ha! The moment he saw her battered figure riddled with dust, Matthias's laughter became more and more devastating to her ears. You! Drawing in a long breath, Matthias wiped his damp lips with the back of his hand. There was a splotch of blood. Just because of a nobody like you. When he turned to look behind him, Leyla had already bolted to the bottom of the tree. She glared at him vehemently and scrunched the picked-up tree branch with her quivering hands. Tears were still dripping from her gleaming eyes. Matthias lifted himself from the ground after receiving such a menacing glare from a woman who was doing the same thing to him. He gazed down, hushedly, at his hand, which had recently grabbed a handful of toasty soil. You may not know. I truly wanted to wring your little neck with this hand. Matthias turned around unhesitatingly after having grabbed his coat. Summer in Berg was brief. When the time was ripe, a cold breeze would blow, and the seasons would change in a jiffy. Matthias was no stranger to it. Leyla was only able to get up after Herhardt was no longer in sight. She picked up her glasses and put them on. Both of her legs seemed to rumble. She walked stumbling, trembling, tripping, and had to take several breaks before she finally reached the cottage. I shouldn't have fallen to the ground. The tears beaded down her cheeks with great regrets. The unpleasant taste was still there, no matter how many times she cleaned her lips with her hand or her apron. Leyla strolled over to the water tap and pumped it hard. The cold water spilled out of the bucket because of the pressure, soaking her clothes, but she didn't care. No, she muttered, unsure about what exactly she was trying to deny. No. 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 Leyla shook her head. The bucket was full as her irregular breathing mingled with those repetitive sentences. She covered her shaking hands and looked around nervously as if she were being hunted by something. But everything was the same. It was Uncle Bill's cottage. The homiest place in the world. The place she endlessly loved. The wind ruffled the leaves, and birds sang while perched on the trees' slats. The backdrop of the forest looked beautifully dazzling and still as the time neared the sunset, bathing everything in a golden shaft of light. But Layla's heart kept throbbing uneasily. She was mystified with what she denied but also didn't know what she was afraid of. One thing was clear though. She had to get away from all this. Leyla took off her glasses and washed her face repeatedly with the water-filled bucket. She wiped the nape of her neck, which was mottled with red marks. She continued to clean her ears, yet the finer traces that he left behind were still vivid. The overcast sky appeared so buff, Leyla stared at it with a blank look on her face. She suddenly clenched her teeth, lifted the bucket, and submerged herself with cold water. Her body trembled with a chill as the water washed her down from the head to toe. Leyla drew water from the tap again, shaking, as she was fed up with the unpleasant memory of her persistent survival. This time, she thoroughly rinsed all over her mouth with her palms full of water. Cough. Splashing water, she thought, would flush away those memories. But it was no use. She still recalled that nasty and absurd things. Cough. Cough. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Leyla stopped washing. Her throat choked as she had accidentally swallowed the water. She crouched, crying, before pumping more water from the tap. Matthias took a leisurely walk around the garden before stopping at the periphery where the rose flower bed garden and the marble stairwell leading to the manor were assembled. Though he had brushed the dust off his clothing, the remnants of it still could be seen in every place. For it was of no account to him. The problem was his memory. Those memories only became more clear whenever he took a step at a time. When Leyla huddled in his arms, any semblance of his rationality evanesced. There was nothing but a hunger-like thirstiness to have her, as if he had morphed into a wild beast. Matthias licked his lips and batted his bangs aside from his forehead. He sought to see how and where this lascivious desire would stop. If that nobody woman, Leyla, hadn't cried, it would have been meaningless, vain, and ultimately insignificant. If only he could restrain himself. If only he could refrain from hurling abuse at such a woman. Perhaps. Rearing his head, Matthias saw the mansion sitting in the tawny sun of the afternoon. Behind him, the forest across the garden seemed to be a desolate world cloaked in stillness. It was quiet. Something stood by itself in a place of nothingness. A hankering interest and ruling passion for a beautiful woman. Matthias haltingly closed his eyes as if erasing something silly that was bothering him. He opened them again and plucked a cluster of roses in full bloom which resembled her tears. From his grasp, the pungent scent of crushed roses spread thickly, poking the nose. It had a pleasing redolence that reminded him of that woman's body odor. He tore it, crushed it, and threw it. The torn and broken rose petals fell scattered strand by strand at his feet in a lumbering pace. The memory of a girl passing through this garden came to his mind one after another along with the fallen petals. Every time he returned home to the Arvis manor, that child always grew up more hardy. A full-blooming rose meadow had become a familiar sight in the neighborhood where the child resided. As the winter months came, the flower bed was peacefully carpeted with snow. Seasons continued to be repeated, the time elapsed, and the girl did grow up and turned into woman like a sequence of scenes. By the end of the day, however, it was all for naught. Matthias fondled his lips with a rose-scented hand and strode over the flake of petals. As the sun began to set, a cool breeze blew clemently, foretelling the end of the summer. Matthias never looked back as he climbed the stairwell and entered the blinding artificial light of the mansion. The sky on the western horizon, where the sun had returned to its nest like the doves, was now tinged with deep purple hues. The darkness ploddingly inked across the room, but Kyle didn't switch the lamplights on. He leaned deeply on a chair by the window, his gaze reared at the sky, which was continuously shifting its radiant shade. Ever since coming back from the Arvis cottage, Kyle had been confined to his room. Without a playful grin teased on his lips, his grayish eyes gave a shady cold nuance. He ate lunch with Leyla in a friendly setting. Kyle didn't say no because she was trying to act as usual, but he knew their time together wasn't the same as before. If he can't find a solution any sooner, he'd have to let her go. Kyle wiped down his dry face with his hand as if washing it. Leyla said that she wished for them to remain good friends for a long time. And to stay as friends, they should keep their distance. He finally grasped the meaning of it. Yet, Kyle had a very different plan. Surely, he wanted to spend a long time with her, but not as a good friend in disguise. Thereby, he was unable to wait for long. Kyle took a hard stance after he came to that conclusion. He didn't want to squander those happy days with Leyla, so it was time to let go of his unseeable feelings. Taking a deep breath, Kyle opened the door and stomped down through the corridor. A dim light glinted, seeping beyond the door of his father's study. Kyle reassured himself in front of the door before drawing yet another breath. At the Duke's party, Kyle got the gist of his mother's reason for presenting him to the aristocracy. He didn't have the faintest notion of what was going through his mother's mind when she was considering engagement or marriage at the time, but today, he was rather grateful for that. Somehow, I can't lose you. Or be apart from each other. How can we do that? Mulling on the words he said to Leyla, Kyle knocked on the door vigorously. Father, it's me. Come on in, Kyle. He heard his father's warm and loving voice beyond the door. Encouraged by his sweetness, Kyle slowly opened the door to the study. Dr. Edman, who sat in front of the desk, smiled as he welcomed his son. Instead of slumping in the chair across his father's desk like he usually did, Kyle stood upright in front of his father. I have something to tell you, father, he said. This isn't something you usually do. It's quite a serious thing to say, isn't it? Yes. Kyle clenched his fists tightly to muster up his courage. When push came to shove, he was going to say this anyway. He heartened himself and swallowed. Next year, he will enroll in the college and leave for the capital. And Leyla, on the other hand, had planned on staying in the city and pursuing a career as a teacher. Distance would separate them for a long time. Kyle, however, wasn't quite convinced with just that. The fact that there would come a day when Kyle Edman wouldn't be standing next to Leyla Lewellin. He pondered upon this. What if they both went to college together? How about they studied as medical and ornithology students at the same time? And what if they lived together for the rest of their lives as they had been? As friends, lovers, and family. Mother seems to be thinking about my marriage nowadays. Dr. Edman soon let loose a short-lived barking yet delightful laugh at what Kyle said. That day, your mother went a little ahead of herself. Don't let it bother you too much, Kyle. I understand your mother's feelings, but I disagree with her. There's no need to hurry. No, father. Kyle looked at his father with a determined glance. I've been thinking of getting married. Marriage? Kyle? You? Dr. Edman's eyes creased slowly as he faced his son. Yes. Kyle replied with a nervous but laid-back voice. I want to marry Leyla and go to college with her. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 24. Blue Candy. The 4 days Leyla spent alone were daunting and somewhat bizarre. Listening to Uncle Bill's word of advice, which she initially ditched as a joke, Leyla locked the window and put the hunting gun hanging in her uncle's room next to her bed. Even after getting ready for her slumber, Leyla stayed awake and had trouble sleeping. She jolted by the owls hooting and suffered from the suddenly flashing nightmares. The Duke's countenance often dawned between dreams of her being beaten or thrown away. The memory of their kiss littered along tirelessly, and deepened in her dreams like a glutinous swamp. The first blush of the morning rose and each passing day seemed so long and eternally lasting. Leyla occupied herself and kept moving without taking a single break. She took care of the livestock, tended to the lawn, and swept and polished everywhere in the already spotless cottage. She washed all the curtains and bedding and even organized the warehouse. Reading a book or studying was the only chore she gave something amiss, as her eyes, strangely, couldn't draw a bead on the book's prose. Leyla had spent the whole day alone, pacing until the nightfall brought upon her another nightmare. On the morning of the 4th day, she went out to take care of the backyard, tightly knotting the apron string behind her. Everything was so mind-numbing. Bill Remmer regularly spent most of his day at work. Apart from helping him with his job, Leyla went through her everyday chores and studies. Living together didn't mean that everything could be done together. They just sat at the same table, returned to the same warm house in the evening, shared stories from their days, and so on. This is the first time, Leyla murmured pensively at the flash of realization. Ever since she was driven to Berg, she hadn't led a single day apart from Uncle Bill. He had always been by her side, and there was never a day that she was alone. Bill Remmer was always there with her, at both day peep and eventide, like a clockwork. But now, she was on her own. The realization that Leyla Lewellin had realized over the span of 4 days brought her another realization. It enlightened her, how lonely, sad, and afraid she was when she wandered in this world, all alone. Leyla plodded a step back after momentarily standing idly. While feeding the chickens and milking the goats, She kept taking a glance across the yard. Her fondest wish for Uncle Bill's return had grown into a sincere prayer. She was pretty sure much of her perplexity and frustration would wither away once he returned. Her loneliness, her teen sadness, the loathsome memory of her first kiss could be forgotten with someone to keep her company. Everything was going to be okay, and things would go back to the way they were before. Kyle Edman. Kyle looked back, startled after someone suddenly hailed his name from behind. His father had already loomed behind his chair. "Yes, Father." Kyle hurried to his feet. A book remained open on the same page for several days on his desk. The page hadn't been flipped since the evening when he announced he would marry Leyla to his father. "You're home early." Kyle alternated between staring out the still bright window and at his father's face. Dr. Edman's lips bent into a gentle smile when he saw his son's starting eyes. "It's a weekend, Kyle." "What? Oh, already?" "I won't ask what you're thinking. I think I know even if you don't tell me." Dr. Edman mumbled a laugh and leaned in the chair where Kyle was slumping a while ago. It was his quirk whenever his father had something to tell. Kyle pulled a chair in front of the table and sat facing his father, a little nervous. His father hadn't answered and was silent on that very day. After giving Kyle a long stare, all he said was to give him a few days to think about it. Kyle was mindful that there was no use of daring to talk when his father had expressed himself in such a manner and tone. Hence, he did nothing but wait. Though his desire tempted him to sprint towards her in that split second. So Kyle endured it and wasted his days living in a slow-moving damn clock. Because he didn't want to hurt Leyla by giving her ambiguous promises. "I completely understand how you feel. I know how much you love Leyla. But Kyle, you and her are still too young to talk about marriage." "But Father, you married Mother when you entered medical school, didn't you?" "That was already 20 years ago. Lady Brandt is only a year older than Leyla, and she's getting engaged next week." "That's Lady Arendt, who was introduced by Mother, is also the same age as Leyla." Seeing Kyle refute every single one of his words with a stiff face, Dr. Edman's laughter eventually burst out. "It seems you're more serious than I thought." "Father, I know I'm still young. I also understand what worries you. Do you love Leyla so much that you're willing to sacrifice anything for her?" "Yes," Kyle answered with no hesitation. For him, loving her was as natural as breathing. And so, it wasn't even necessary to take it for granted. "I can help Leyla go to college by becoming her sponsor." With a stern yet loving gaze, Dr. Edman looked at his beloved son dearly. "Leyla is a good child. She's good-minded and smart. I know her well, Kyle, and I'm willing to sponsor her to go to college if she wants to. Of course, I'm really hoping Leyla can continue in her favorite field of study. But Father, what I want the most is to marry her. It takes more than two people to make a marriage happen. Household, dignity and prestige. I'm not saying that those things are unimportant." "So, how come you're so obstinate?" "No matter how important those things are, Father, there can't be something more important than the person who will be with you for the rest of your life." "Kyle, I want to be a great doctor, as well as a good husband and father. As much as you. But, Father, everything starts with Leyla for me," Kyle said. His heart started to pound, almost as if it wanted to bawl out of his chest. But he suppressed it and began to broach about all the things he had kept under his hat for years. "I want to live with Leyla, by her side, as Layla's good person, her good husband, the good father of her child." His heart now felt like it would burst open, but Kyle went on to say, "If I have Leyla by my side, I firmly believe that I can make all of that happen, but Father, without her, those things are just a pie in the sky." He spelled back to his father in a firm, unwavering tone. "Without her, I don't have the confidence to live as such a person." Kyle raised his head to see his father, his hands clamped together on his lap. "I believe Leyla is a woman who meets both her father's and mother's expectations. She's perhaps the most wonderful thing I've ever had." Dr. Edman gave the eye to his son with a solemn face. "I don't want to lose her." Kyle's eyes glistened with a determined light. "Please help me protect Leyla, Father." Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. The night was getting longer, but Bill Remmer hadn't returned yet. Leyla sat drowsily on a porch chair, waiting for him since she couldn't think of any more domestic chores to focus on. Uncle Bill's vacant chair felt so big today in a strange kind of way. Was there a mishap of any sort? The alarming notion that passed Leyla's mind made her spring to her feet. One day, she recalled reading an article in the newspaper about a rail accident. Trains, in addition to carriages and cars, often engaged in a variety of incidents. Which train was it? Leyla circled around the yard and plucked up her courage to head towards the mansion's gate by the time the sun plummeted. It had become a path she couldn't cross in the last few days due to her fear of encountering the Duke. For every step she took, Leyla kept thinking of Uncle Bill. She did have a propensity of assuming the worst since she was a little girl. The unhappiness of a like clay pigeon person was harrowing. So she believed, if she had just the barest of preparations, at least, she would be able to accept the ill fortune without becoming too overwhelmed. Leyla braced herself for the unhappiness that would follow after her relatives stared at her with displeasure in their eyes. Don't cry even if you get hit. You'll hear harsh words, but don't get hurt. I should be polite and brave even when I'm getting kicked out. I'll try to smile brighter on my way to another house next time. Her efforts had been fruitful. Leyla was less hurt and able to smile a little better. The misfortunes seemed to follow her like straw in the wind, but she was able to bear them with ease, because she had steeled herself, ready for everything. But, she was having qualms when it came to Uncle Bill. Uncle. Calling his name, she passed the entrance to the mansion. Uncle Bill was not the type of person to leave her behind. Undoubtedly, he would return. But if he didn't, then please come back. Leyla put her hands together like she was praying. Don't leave me alone. The picture of her from yesterday, which had calmly soothed the man who had been frightened about leaving her for 4 days, now had dissipated, replaced by her own worry. Mom, where are you going? Leyla innocently inquired of her mother when she gave her candy in a pretty glass jar for the first time in her life. That day, her mother was as lovely as the sweets she was holding. Far away. Her mother had been looking at her for quite some time, as she replied in a word. Then, are you coming home late? Leyla asked again, impatiently, since she was eager to taste the candy. Yes. How late? Very late. You were coming home before I finish eating this, right? Leyla shook the glass jar full of colorful candies and her mother languidly nodded. Yes. Again. She gave a short reply. I will. You shouldn't have left me such an answer if you're going to forsake me. Her mother was reputed to be too beautiful to exist as the wife of a poor man. She had eventually fled, leaving behind her husband and daughter as if she were discarding her ill-fitting clothes. In keeping with the grapevines, she had become a high nobility's mistress or married a silk-stocking merchant, and emigrated to another country. People enjoyed overblown and twisted rumors like these which often soon withered. The only thing left was a man abandoned by his beautiful wife and a neglected young daughter, let alone such a cruel reality. Thenceforth, her loving father became an alcoholic and bedrinked every day. He didn't want to see Leyla's face any longer, because it was hard for him to look at someone who reminded him of his truant wife. Leyla cherished her candies as she awaited her mother's homecoming. By the time the bottom of the pretty glass bottle was exposed, she realized that her mother would never return. But she didn't want to accept that painful truth. That's why she couldn't eat the last piece of her candy. She ate that last candy for dinner only after she was left all alone in the world. Her father, whose health was ruined by alcohol, at a later time passed away due to sickness. Was it a foreshadowing of his departure and last farewell? Her father, who had ignored his daughter for years, smiled at her on the day he died. Let's go to the park together when the flowers bloom, Leyla, her father whispered in a lifeless voice. But, after he departed that evening, his words only became a vain will. Don't leave any promises if you're leaving. Leyla was orphaned in an empty house. Her relatives couldn't figure out what to do with the troublesome child, so they deserted her for a time. It seemed as if they were gawking at her. There was nothing left for her save the empty words of a worthless promise and a solitary piece of candy that provided little comfort. Even after all these years, Leyla still remembered the color of that candy. A glossy blue luster of confectionery that glistened much like crystal. A few days later, On the day when there was nothing else left to eat, Leyla ended up eating the last candy. When she nibbled on it hard, some of the shattered candy shards scraped her fragile gum and the tender skin of her taste buds. Her mouth was bleeding, but Leyla went on munching on the crunchy candy. Tears streamed down her eyes as she ate it. Her sadness tasted so sweet, like biting into a luscious candy but with a fishy aftertaste. There was a shower of blooms outside the window, ornamenting the scene with spots of dappled sunlight. It was an afternoon in early spring when the wafting pale pink flower petals in the breeze looked like falling flakes of snow on a fresh layer of grass. "Uncle?" Layla's eyes went wide with surprise on her walk along Platanis Road. "Uncle." A dazzling smile flourished over her face. "Uncle. Uncle Bill." Leyla ran toward Bill Remmer, who was crossing the road from the opposite side. At the same time when a black limousine transporting the Duke entered the Platanis roadway. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 25. The Color of My Sadness. By a mere chance, Matthias saw Leyla through the other side of the car window. Leyla was running across the road with a beaming smile on her face that he had never seen before. She let her long, loose blonde hair whip around by the wind following her springing footsteps. Matthias clenched his hand slightly. He was about to tell the driver to slow down the car, but eventually, he changed his mind and merely scoped a glance at her running towards a middle-aged man who was none other than Bill Remmer. Leyla leapt with light steps into the gardener's arms like a winged bird, and the gardener caught her in a bear hug. She appeared like a little girl in his big arms and smiled so widely as if it were the brightest smile in the world, and seeing that the gardener burst into laughter. At that moment, the car whizzed past them. Matthias left his gaze from the window and peered down onto his hands. From that slightly raised hand, he still could feel her touch and the lingering smell of her body on that day. The engagement was soon around the corner. By the time Matthias felt alleviated by that verity, the car had passed through the gate of the Arvis mansion. Leyla's wish came true. Everything was back to being fine after Uncle Bill's return. Her adolescent sadness, the unpleasant memories of her horrible first kiss, all of her bewilderment and despair wound down as she was no longer alone. In the meantime, the morning and evening weather grew chillier. The days wore down, and the Arvis manor began to have a more stately, jubilant atmosphere than it ever had in the past. "Oh, don't even mention it, I'll serve all the greatest cuisine in the world." Madame Mona, who had barely made it to the forest, kicked up the rumpus with a straight face. She leaned leisurely on a chair next to Bill Remmer and began to plead in earnest. "I'm already scared to think how grand their wedding would be if their engagement ceremony is so ritzy like this." Leyla had just returned from milking the goats and greeted her with a cheerful smile. "Wait a little longer, Leyla. Tomorrow I will make your mouth water until you're sick of it. Regardless of how many guests are invited, they won't be able to finish half of the food I will cook." Leyla unconsciously clutched the tip of her blouse at Madame Mona's hearty laugh. The hickeys sewed by the Duke on her neck were still painfully obvious even after a few days. The red marks which showed in the mirror every time she looked in it made her feel ashamed and disgusted. "Is the engagement ceremony already tomorrow?" "Please, don't use the word already, Leyla. I hope that, no. I'm simply hoping for a quick ending to this engagement ceremony." "It's tomorrow," Leyla muttered quietly, then smiled again. "Yes, Auntie. I will wait for it." She sought to grin more brightly as if to erase her nightmare-like memory. Ever since that day, the Duke had never once set his foot in the forest. Pleased to state, it was a glee for Leyla to know that. "I like chocolate cookies. And raspberry cake too." "I'll bring you a bulk of chocolate or raspberries." "How can I repay you?" asked Leyla. "Repay? Just eat a lot and grow up well." "Do I have to grow up to be as big as Uncle Bill?" "Oh my God, Leyla. You'll be single for life if you grow up to his size." Madame Mona giggled as she rose from her seat and waved goodbye. Bill Remmer furrowed his brows, but later he tardily joined in the mirth. Not long after she left, the usual night dawned at the cottage. After having supper with her uncle, Leyla tidied the house and reopened the textbook she had overlooked till now. She opted to sleep for a little while as drowsiness engulfed her. But by the time she awoke, the sun-up had already begun to appear, and the Duke's engagement day was already here. Leyla put on her glasses from the desk and rubbed her sleepy eyes before strolling up to the window. She flung the window wide, letting the cold morning air flood in. The wee hours of the morning drew near and the sky was dyed with a clear, transparent tint of blue. Leyla reared up her eyes. The hue of the azure sky today reminded her of the color of her last piece of candy. The Duke's eyes were also blue, similar to the shade of that candy's. Claudine picked a pastel pink dress for her red letter day. Donned in a gown garlanded with chiffon on top of the silk, her figure was so graceful and stunning as the event's protagonist. "You're so gorgeous, Claudine." Countess Brandt cheered in jollies as she watched her daughter. Her face was etched with awed looks, akin to those of the Brandt's maid, who stood in the rear of the room. Claudine smiled sweetly to show her gratitude for the honeyed flattery that had been bestowed upon her. Even at this moment, the spark of pride and satisfaction in her eyes didn't wear off after seeing her reflection in the mirror. It was Claudine's idea, holding the engagement ceremony at the Arvis manor. Aside from wanting to show respect for the Herhardt family, Claudine wanted to assure through dint of her presence that she was gonna be the Arvis's next Duchess. "Marie, is she still not here?" Claudine turned slightly and asked the maid as she wondered. "She should have arrived by this time." "Oh, look over there. She's coming from the garden," the maid hurriedly exclaimed, and Countess Brandt creased her brows as she looked out of the window. Leyla Lewellin was seen ascending the marble staircase bridging the rose garden to the mansion, carrying a basket of flowers in her hands. "Goodness me, Claudine. Did you bring her in again?" "It's okay, Mom." Claudine calmly lulled her mother. "I merely need flower ornaments in my hair to make them look nice." "Is there a reason why it had to be her?" "Well, there is no specific reason." Claudine shrugged her shoulders, then stepped in front of the mirror once again. Her face reflected in the mirror was no longer smiling. "It's a good thing to get flowers and congrats from an old friend." The Arvis house was wrapped up in a festive excitement as the Duke Herhardt's residence ready to greet the guests who would be in attendance for the engagement party later in the afternoon. Leyla plotted the passageway behind the mansion designed for servants to enter. Her feet shook nervously numerous times as she was treading on a floor that sparkled like a clear mirror. Claudine had sent a maid to the cottage to call her in. Leyla immediately knew the moment she was told to pick roses to decorate her hair. "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." It wasn't a matter of flowers that Lady Brandt wanted to meet her for. Leyla began to slow her pace down as she neared the east side of the fourth floor. It was a guest bedroom where Claudine was staying in. Her hand, which was holding the basket, stood out pallid. Her heart felt as if it would pound out of her chest and her lips were feeling parched. "No," Leyla mumbled, convincing herself. "It's merely an unfortunate accident. The Duke would also think the same. So it's fine. There's nothing to be scared of." While she was hesitating, trying to make up her mind, Leyla had already set her foot in front of Claudine's bedroom. She knocked on the door and it began to slide open slowly. "Hello, miss. I've brought you the roses you had asked for." Leyla greeted her with politeness like she usually did. She had brought Claudine a bouquet of roses in the color pink, which matched the shade of the dress she was attiring for today's occasion. Claudine approached Leyla with a wide smile. "How do I look? Do I look good?" "Yes, miss. You look beautiful," Leyla answered wholeheartedly. She would be lying if she said she wasn't. Claudine's beauty today was undeniably as beautiful as a blooming rose. "Before, I was very anxious, but now that you have said so, I feel relieved. Do you think Duke Herhardt will think the same too?" "Yes." The Duke's name that came out suddenly from Claudine's mouth made her flinch. "I'm sure he will." A faint tremor was noticeable in her voice. Leyla felt woefully pathetic, as if she were a child who had done something wrong. Their kiss was an unpleasant incident, but she couldn't rule out her feeling of guilt as if she had become a shameless thief who stole Claudine's fiancé. Leyla he could see that her pride she had puffed up and toiled for in front of Claudine for so many years had been shattered, making her look shabby at this given time. Claudine gave a sideways glimpse at a maid to accept the rose basket. And, as if it were a natural thing, she gave out a handful of gold coins to Leyla. The amount of money she gifted to her today was more than usual. Unknowing it just served to wound Layla's heart even more gravely. "What are you doing? Why aren't you showing your gratitude?" the frowning maid rebuked her. Layla quickly bowed her head while tightly gripping the money in her hand. She didn't feel insulted bowing down to Claudine, as she had repeated this stance countless times since she was a child and had been used to it. "Thank you, miss." Thankfully, Layla was able to convey her thanks calmly. Claudine, who had been staring at her with a deadpan face, soon regained her bright smile. "No problem. Instead, I should be the one to say thanks, Layla. Thanks to you, this engagement ceremony will turn out to be perfect." Claudine turned around as she was done with the talk. Layla gasped a big sigh and rushed out of the room in a headlong dash. What was buzzing around inside her head right now was the urge to get out of this uncomfortable and unfamiliar place as quickly as possible, but she couldn't act in a reckless manner inside the mansion. She neatened her clothes and organized her flower basket first before walking down the corridor meant for workers at the quickest possible speed. She was about to walk through the passageway's entry door when a surprise caught her. Just as she was about to turn the corner, she crossed the path with the Duke, who had come up the stairs. "It looks like you've been doing Lady Brandt's errands, Layla." Butler Hassan, who stood behind the Duke, spoke with a gracious smile. Layla greeted him back politely and scurried back to the side of the corridor. She only wanted to go ahead, but the Duke stopped still and lowered his gaze on her. Her cheek flushed. She bent her head even deeper as she dared not to make eye contact with him. It was just eye contact, but her heart was erratically pounding. While the Duke looked fine, as if he couldn't care any less. It seemed he had forgotten everything that had happened between them. "How foolish of me. How could my heart throb in snatches of a man like him?" The Duke walked past her just as she wanted to run away unmannerly. Only after she could no longer hear the stomping of his shoe steps did Layla dare to move her feet and leave the mansion. After completing her errands, Layla returned to her daily routine. As the evening drew near, the guests invited to the engagement party began to flock to Manor. In contrast with the rollicking mansion, the little cottage loomed peacefully deep in the forest as if it had been sojourned in another world. There, Layla lived her life diligently. She weeded the garden and cleaned the goat pen. Continued by cooking a stew for dinner and folded up the sun-dried laundry stocked in the hamper. After all of her house chores were finished, Layla took a leisurely walk in the forest to get a thrill of nature. She was enjoying her stroll before long she realized she had arrived at the riverside. Layla clambered her favorite beautiful tree to watch the evening scenery laid bare on a windless summer day. The awe-inspiring view surrounded her. Birds were soaring above the sky, the red-tinged Shelter River drenched in light by the setting sun, and a white swan-like annex floating on it, all of which led to greater beauty of the scene. It was a millions-worth sight to see. Her eyes were drawn to all of those beautiful things. As the sun set, a few thin strips of the cloud on the horizon turned shimmering gold. The clear darkness of early nightfall settled over the sky like the blue candy she remembered from her childhood. The thought came to her. The Duke's eyes were likewise the same as those colors. "Your blue eyes are the same as the color of my sadness." Layla laughed a little as she somehow was feeling dejected. Then suddenly, she sensed someone's presence approaching her. "Kyle!" Layla shouted with delight when a familiar face standing underneath the tree. "How did you know I was here?" "You like taking a stroll on a summer evening. When you go out for evening walks you always go to this river." Kyle's playfulness had disappeared, and his eyes were deeper and gentler than they had ever been. Layla observed him quietly. His gaze towards her felt a little strange. The wind was sighing through the river. The sound of the leaves rustling in the treetops and the boughs moaning breached the silence that had been created between them. "Layla." Kyle opened his lips after a while. Layla replied by tilting her head a little as she waited for him to speak. "Let's get married." Those overly unrealistic words were torn asunder on a gentle evening breeze. Layla was dreamingly dazed in disbelief, but now Kyle said it once again. This time with a more serious tone. "Let's get married, Layla. Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 26. Let's get married. The spring season came a little earlier in Rats, the capital of the Berg Empire, which was located in the southernmost province of Karlsbar. Arvis' estate was starting to bear buds as May came, but the whole city of rats was already awash with the sweet scent of roses. Matthias had a sudden glimpse of thought over the changing of the season while passing through the gardens of the Crown Prince's palace. He suddenly halted in his steps, and the other officers who were trailing from behind stopped as well. "What's up?" "No." Matthias answered short, "Nothing." He smiled a little, the tip of his lips lifting. The brief silence broke after Matthias got his stride back. The young aristocratic guard officers continued to converse playfully. Their faces and voices glowed with excitement while discussing how to spend this fine spring weekend, and roughly met with a very similar conclusion altogether: party, horse racing. Alternatively, having a spring date with a lover. "Our captain will leave his fiancée and spend a lonely spring." The horde of officers giggled in a bunch when one of their peers cracked a joke. Matthias just casually grinned and gave a faint chuckle in response to his men's jesting. The engagement ceremony between Duke Herhardt and Lady Brandt, which was hosted at the end of last summer, took place successfully. Over several weeks, the couple who had been officially betrothed had become a hot topic of buzz within the society. However, Matthias didn't feel much of a change from his everyday life. A week after his engagement, he was assigned to the Berg's army garrison and had to leave for the capital the day after. Meanwhile, Claudine, who had been staying in Arvis' estate, returned to the Brandt's estate, which was situated in the center of Karlsbar, a metropolis that was a long distance away from the capital city of rats. So, nothing had changed from their previous mode of living, except for the fact that their engagement had been made public. During the social season, Claudine stayed at the mansion the Brandts had in Rats for a while. It was nothing new for her, however, since she had been a regular visitor to the estate on a seasonal basis for quite some time before then. Aside from that, they also attended the social events together, as they always did in the past. Everything else basically remained the same, except that they now had a definite official status as each other's fiancés, which was the only thing that had altered in their life. "I'm about to finish my military service soon. What about you, Matthias?" A fellow officer who was strolling alongside him posed a question that drew everyone's attention to Matthias. "Currently, I'm thinking about extending it for another year." As soon as he said that, those around him seemed to be taken aback by his surprising answer. "Aren't you going to get married and focus on the family business?" "The wedding? Maybe next year." "Is it because the hot dish over Duke Herhardt's marriage has eased in social circles? So you want to postpone the wedding?" Matthias flicked his chin instead of answering. Rather than calling it a postponement, things went that way naturally, like it was supposed to. He intended to stay in the capital for another year. At the same time, the Brandts wished for their daughter to spend her honeymoon in Arvis with her husband. When the Brandts first requested for the engagement to be tabled for one more year, the Herhardt family consented without hesitation. Given her young age, there was no pressing need for Claudine to get betrothed so soon. And more than anything else, both families yearned for this marriage to be perfect from the beginning. After leaving the imperial palace, Matthias didn't waste any time returning to his home. In terms of age, the old brick mansion, which was located in the heart of Rats, was the second oldest building among the Herhardt family's properties after the Arvis mansion on their estate. That mansion served as the family's headquarters for generations, during the time they were responsible for the capital's work. The architecture of the house was more modest and classic compared to the Arvis manor, which epitomized the aesthetic tastes of the hostesses. "The two madams are here," reported the servant as he approached Matthias, who had just got out of the car. "My mother and grandmother?" "Yes, the madams arrived this morning. They said they came here to attend the forthcoming wedding of Her Majesty the Crown Princess." Matthias nodded his head and slowly entered the mansion. The princess, whose pride had been crushed after being pushed out and losing the seat of the Duchess Herhardt's, was eager to find another running mate so that she could proceed with the wedding ceremony as she planned. Thereafter, the title of her spouse fell to the Grand Duke of a nearby duchy with the same social standing as the Herhardts. "It's been a while, Matthias." Katerina von Herhardt, waiting for Matthias to enter the foyer, greeted him with a bright smile and wide-opened arms. "Son, we can see your face only when we come here like this." While his mother Elise stayed the same as always, her approach towards her only son was more straightforward. Matthias approached the two with a warm smile on his face. It was another Saturday afternoon, as much as every other day. Just like the brimming garden of blossoming roses during the early season of spring. "The weather this evening is so nice, Leyla." Kyle walked up to her with a jolly face after parking his bike. Leyla, who was busy helping Bill clean his cart in the garden, quickly turned her head towards the voice. So did Bill, who was holding a shovel. "Let's get married," Kyle shouted. After hearing it over and over again, his marriage proposal no longer came as a surprise, and it sounded more like a daily morning greeting these days. After having taken a slight pause for a moment, Leyla and Bill nonchalantly returned to their work. "Hello, Kyle." Leyla greeted him brightly as she carried whatever was left over of the planted seedlings. "I'm not getting married." Leyla spoke in a friendly tone afterward, emphasizing her firm rejection of his proposal. Sigh. Bill heaved a sigh. He seemed to be feeling the pain of Kyle's broken heart. But in contrast, Kyle appeared unfazed by Leyla's constant rejection. He just smiled gently and volunteered to help her without being asked. "Fine. I'll accept your rejection today. I'll ask you again tomorrow, then." "Enough. Don't ask anymore." "No, I will keep asking." A person's mind is bound to change. With the way he was behaving, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that Kyle's shameless and stubborn spirit was maybe the toughest in the whole Berg Empire. Bill tried to maintain a straight face as he looked at Kyle and Leyla while struggling to stifle his laughter. Kyle Letman began to propose in the late summer, and stuck to his guns until the seasons changed several times. When Bill first found out that Kyle had proposed to Leyla, he believed it was most likely due to one of the two possible causes. Either that kid was drunk, considering he couldn't drink well, or he was insane. That's why Bill didn't smack him in the head with a shovel after all. But the following day, Kyle showed up again with a very sane face and repeated the same thing. "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." "How many times has it been since then?" Kyle stopped by the cottage without missing a day throughout fall, winter, and even this spring, saying the same thing every time. Only to be rejected on every one of those visits. At first, Bill was cheering for Leyla since she was so staunch, but he began to feel sorry for Kyle and his plight as time went on. If it weren't for his father, Bill would have been excessively vocal with Kyle to get him to stop his doing. Bill, however, opted not to speak more since Dr. Edmund had granted his son a green light. "How about sending Leyla off to college?" said Dr. Edmund when he paid a visit to Bill at his cottage last fall. Bill's heart suddenly slumped like a dreary chimney pot. Even if he wished Leyla could pursue her study to a higher level, his current circumstances, in which he was forced to live from hand to mouth, prevented him from doing so. When he replied hesitatingly, "I can't afford it," Dr. Edmund's face was lit up with a smile. He continued, "If our children have feelings for each other and want to become a couple, it would be good to get them married and send them to college together." Bill stared blankly at the doctor in stupefaction. He couldn't believe what he had heard, though he was thrilled with the offer. To him, Leyla was the most wonderful child in the world. Yet, he soon realized that the rest of the world had its own set of standards that he couldn't grasp. One of those was regarding the Edmund family's social standing in Carlsbar society, something about which he had been entirely clueless up until today. Dr. Edmund seemed to understand his befuddlement, so therefore, he spoke first. "Kyle said that Leyla is the one person who could bring out the best in him, so he wants to live by her side as a decent person for her." Bill was reasonably surprised, as he learned that the young boy who spent most of his time lounging lazily in his cottage and stuffing his stomach with free food had said something like that to his father. It was a very sincere thought that came from youngsters who are still in their adolescence. "But Dr. Leyla is..." Bill clammed up, but Dr. Edmund's expression grew kinder. "I don't require his future bride to come from a wealthy family or have a perfect upbringing. Because I know that Leyla is a good child even if she doesn't have such privileges. He said so with a smiling face that resembled that of his son. If Kyle doesn't change his mind till he decides on his career path next year, I'd like to allow them to be together. How about you, Mr. Remmer? Deep down in his heart, Bill Remmer was on a cloud nine and felt grateful that he was willing to carry Dr. Edmund, whom he regarded to be an angel in human form, on his back and run across the Karlsbar or even the Holberg Empire. It didn't matter how tired his physical state was, Bill would be able to endure it every time he pictured Layla's happy face in front of him. Those were his true feelings. Kyle's stupid proposal may have ended up being a blessing in disguise for Leyla. Bill tossed the shovel into the warehouse as he had made up his mind to do something about this matter. Oh, Matthias. You know Dr. Edmund's son, don't you? Leyla von Herhardt lowered her voice a smidgen amid a boring talk on the princess's nuptials. It was just the two of them at the spacious dining table, savoring their blue plate dinner since Katerina had gone to bed early that night. Yes, mother. Matthias nodded calmly, putting down the glass of water from which he had taken a sip on the table. Kyle Edmund. Dr. Edmund's only son. You're right. That kid, Kyle, he's getting married. Her voice sounded keen. It was a hint that the woman who became Kyle's Edmund's companion was an unwelcome figure. But Matthias remained quiet, patiently waiting for his mother to finish her story. She's an orphan raised by our gardener, if I'm not mistaken. Her name is Leyla. Leyla, Matthias muttered, with no sound flowing from his lips. It doesn't seem to me that she will satisfy the criteria of the Edmunds as their prospective daughter-in-law. His throat felt a little tight when he heard his mother mention her name. It's amusing, don't you think? Matthias then came up with a bland retort. Sadly, all of grandmother's efforts to find him a good mate have been in vain. His voice was a bit taut for some reason. Matthias didn't give a further response, but Leyla enthusiastically recounted Kyle Edmund's marriage story, which had been garnering a lot of snooping in the Arvis estate these days. Mrs. Edmund was teed off with Kyle's decision to marry Leyla since she had been striving for years to get a title from her in-laws' family, which now she was unable to get because of her son's choice. However, it seemed that she was actually put on the spot in the face of her husband and son's wishes. If all went according to plan, rumors said that Leyla would marry the doctor's son and continue her education. After they went for their honeymoon in Rats, they would attend college together. After the upcoming summer passed, shortly after the season of roses, grandmother must be heartbroken. She really adores Dr. Edmund's son. Yeah. She must be. Matthias put down his cutlery and grabbed a napery on the table with his alabaster hand. I feel so sorry for Mrs. Edmund. She was a respectable doctor's wife, much more so than them, who were nobles in status. But she lost her hard-earned social standing because of the ridiculous daughter-in-law. Leyla took a sip of wine to moisten her lips. What kind of noble would want to befriend a wife who takes a low-life orphan as her daughter-in-law? The situation may change. Matthias straightened his posture and turned to face his mother. Because they're not married yet. Well, Matthias, if things could be changed, Mrs. Edmund wouldn't have been so depressed like this. As you know, Dr. Edmund is a persistent person and above all, Kyle is completely smitten with that orphan child. Leyla flicked her tongue, expressing her sympathies for the doctor's wife, who was about to be shunned by society as of now. She's a remarkably pretty girl. It was a troublesome reason why her son couldn't get away from her. When she rang the bell, the waiting maid started to serve the dessert on the table. I can't believe that girl was able to take over Mrs. Edmund's position in such a blatant way. She's a real freak. No, should I say she's smart? Leyla shrugged her shoulders lightly and slid her dessert fork into her mouth. Actually, it's absurd to place the blame on her alone. The most foolish is Mrs. Edmund's son, who got blinded by a girl and brought disgrace upon his whole family. After she was satisfied with schmoozing and reaching her desired conclusion, Leyla von Herhardt finally changed the topic of her talk. Now, she was back to bring up the topic of her social life, which included a slew of well-known and uninteresting names. Matthias, on the other hand, stayed deafeningly quiet while listening to her drone on. Leyla. That name lingered on the tip of his tongue, like the sip's taste of wine that had left a sweet mark on him. Leyla Lewellin. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 27. Season of Roses Without You. The night had fallen outside when Matthias stepped out of the bathroom after finishing his shower. With the strap of his robe loosened, he leaned against the windowsill which overlooked the garden below. Compared to the Arvis manor, a sprawling estate renowned for its beautiful gardens and forests, the garden of the Rat's mansion was considerably more homely. Its garden wasn't that big as the manor was located in the center of town. Neither the previous Dukes of Herhardt nor Matthias himself had even the slightest interest in landscaping or floriculture. For that reason, the Rat's garden was landscaped modestly to add on to the mansion's austere style of architecture. Once the spring season arrived and the roses of different varieties imported from Arvis were in full bloom, the flower beds transformed the drab gardens into a sight that was well worth seeing. When the scent of flowers began to linger in the blowing wind, Matthias had a passing thought about returning to the estate for the summer break. Before suddenly, the shadow of a girl who had been diligently wandering about the garden, helping the gardener, snapped him out of his reverie. Leyla. Matthias unwittingly frowned. That girl smelled like a rose. A gardener with a natural aptitude for growing roses had painstakingly succeeded in blossoming one of the most beautiful roses in the world. But he never thought the precious rose the gardener raised in the woods would soon become his misfortune. Leyla, the nobody girl. That was the name that had been embedded in her. Matthias closed the window and turned around. Droplets of water from his wet hair sprinkled over his feet. Still, didn't fortune favor her now? Someone like Leyla Lewellin could only dream of having a companion like a doctor's son. She was blessed with once-in-lifetime great luck. Thanks to Kyle Ettman's foolish naivety, she could become the future Mrs. Ettman and attend college in the nation's capital. Leyla. Matthias made a hushed mention of her name beneath his breath. He mused for a beat. Perhaps, if that beautiful thing disappeared from his sight, things might turn out better for him as well. Assuming this was true, he should give her a bigger round of applause for the marriage more than anyone else. Even when he closed the window, the smell of roses still lingered on the tip of his nose. Matthias spotted a vase of roses that had been put on the console table. Someone seemed to have plucked the roses that had bloomed in the garden and placed them in his bedroom. After passing by the vase, his gaze was rested on the golden cage he had brought along with him to Rats and then turned towards the vase again. Leyla. Her name sounded even sweeter when he said it with more clarity. The roses had bloomed but you're not here. Meanwhile, he was lost in his musings. Matthias suddenly snatched the coveted roses from the vase and clasped them firmly with his hand. The memories of Leyla, who had tears pouring down her face, flooded back into his mind. The pale pink roses reminded him of her sobbing cheeks, which were dripping wet with tears. Matthias' grip on the rose gradually became tighter and tighter until the flower was crushed to a jumble of petals in his palms. It's a good thing. He conscientiously believed so. But Matthias' eyes narrowed slowly. Can there be a season where the roses bloom without you there? The flowers will blossom, and I will return, but why aren't you there with me? In those questions, Matthias revived a memory that he wasn't even aware he had. That the child was always there in the rose-filled summer garden, as if she had become an inseparable part of Arvis itself. Which means she was also a part of him. His little yellow bird chirped when it couldn't fly after he cut its wing off. Matthias now felt a strong urge to kill a person for the first time in his life at this point. It was unclear which one of them. Whether it was the doctor's son or that woman. It wasn't until the night had gotten dim when Matthias released the petals that became a hard lump. His rose-scented hand reached out and took one of the papers on the table and tore it into shreds. It was a document required to be submitted by the end of the following week. An eligibility document to extend 1-year service as a military officer. I wholeheartedly give my approval. Bill strenuously broached his long hesitated words. Sitting across the table, Leyla was gazing at him with a perplexed face. That glutton, Kyle. I agree. You have my blessing. Hey, Uncle. Leyla frowned. But Bill kept running his mouth off. Stop rejecting him now. Marry him and go to college. I really want you to do that, Leyla. I can't do that. Don't you like Kyle, too? I do. It doesn't make sense for me to marry him. What do you mean by it makes no sense? What's so strange about two people liking each other and getting married? Bill choked up, but Layla's eyes were fixed on him and didn't budge. Kyle and his family will become everybody's fool because of me. Dr. Atman has allowed it, too. But Leyla, stop thinking about this and that and just look into your heart. Bill raised the tone of his voice. If you like Kyle, get married, but if you don't like him, then don't. You don't need to think about anything else. Leyla blinked her eyes shut at his words and took a big gulp of the beer before her. Bill quietly watched her. The child he had nurtured had now grown into a great drinker. Now, they were each other's best drinking buddies. Ones who could share their woes while sipping a pint of beer together. I like Kyle. There's no other friend in the world who is as comfortable, warm and kind as him. Leyla wiped the beer's froth from the corner of her lips as she eyed Bill even more sternly. So, I don't want to bring shame on him. No, what's wrong with you, Leyla? Why are you looking down on yourself? It's not like that. Uncle, I like the person I've become. No matter what other people think of me, I've never been embarrassed of who I am. All I want to do is be a good and responsible adult, much like you wish for. Leyla knitted her brows. Her eyes clouded over with somberness beyond her glasses. But, Uncle, I'm completely clueless when it comes to marriage. If I were to get married right now, it would mean that all of my efforts have been in vain. Huh? I hope you're not possibly thinking of spending all your life stuck in this cabin, old widower, for the rest of your life, Leyla. I'd love to. I don't want to leave this Arvis forest, Uncle. And neither do you. That's a terrible thing to say. Now that I have a teaching certification, I'm going to get a job at a school nearby. And I want to live like this forever. Living here, together with you, Uncle. Maybe I can help you, too. Is this forest going to run? It's going nowhere. And I'm always going to be here in this forest. Well, maybe someday when I'm getting older and don't have the stamina to continue working as a gardener, I'll resign and leave this place. However, I'm still healthy, and I'll still be in good shape for the next 10 years as well. Bill gulped down his beer. Leyla, whether you leave here, go to college, get married, wherever you are, whatever you do, you will always be my little Leyla. Bill reached out and gently squeezed Layla's tiny hand on the table. The college entrance exam was just around the corner, but Leyla still had no signs of changing her mind. Bill was so frustrated that he had decided to arrange this talk with her today. If you get married to the Etman household, you'll be living in the neighborhood. There's nothing better than that. Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site. Thanks, Uncle. Leyla, there's a very rare kind of man in the world. A man who assured me that he would be a good husband and a good father. And Kyle is the kind of man who fits that bill. As he smiled, Bill patted the back of Layla's hand with his palm. Think about this. I hope you get married to a nice guy and build a real family. Make your home a hive of life, filled with the sound of children laughing. I believe Kyle will never let you be lonely. We're an actual family too. Leyla, who was fiddling with Bill's fingers, raised her head. The corners of her eyes were red. Uncle, we are also a family. A real one. What's that? Since she came from Lovida, this hapless child had carried tear sacks full of sadness with her. Bill's eyes would sometimes heat up and get teary when he looked at her. If you think we're a real family, you should listen to me even more. Bill yelled and dropped an envelope he had prepared in advance in front of Leyla. Immediately upon receiving and opening the envelope, Layla's eyes widened. Inside the envelope was a train ticket to Rats with a sum of money to cover travel costs. The test is next week. Study hard from tomorrow. You always work hard, but you still have to work harder to pass. If you don't go to Lats, then I'll consider us as a fake family. Uncle, if you don't take the entrance exam, I won't see you again, Leyla. Bill had let go of her hand and sat with his shoulders straight. He stared down at her with a severe look. Albeit, his eyes were endlessly warm, with no hint of a threatening expression in them at all. Leyla was lost in thought with the envelope in her hand. Bill looked at her deeply, wholeheartedly, At the figure of a bright and lovely child before his eyes, things that for him hadn't changed and had remained the same since she was a little kid. After contemplating for quite some time, Leyla ultimately made a difficult choice. She stuck her sparkling glass of beer in front of Bill with a still severe expression on her face, as she had done in the old days, drawing on her pupillage when she tried to bump her glass of apple juice into Bill's glass of beer. Bill gladly bumped his glass against hers. Leyla downed the beer all in one go and drained the glass entirely of its contents. Her cheeks quickly began to flush, but she remained steadfast in her pretense of being a good drinker. Even though we're apart, we're still a real family, right? That smothering question came close to bringing tears to Bill's eyes all over again. Don't be worried about that. Unlike his blunt way of speaking, Bill smiled so warmly at her. Leyla smiled as she watched him still. They were like a genuine family. You will definitely like it the most. The Museum of Natural History. Kyle once again spoke excitedly. It'll probably be like heaven for you. He was listing out the must-see places in Rats and was most excited when he began to talk about the Natural History Museum. Outside the window of the rattling train they were riding, a breathtakingly beautiful sight of springtime landscapes with flowers in full bloom greeted them everywhere. This was Layla's first visit to Rats, and she couldn't have been thrilled. But for Kyle, it was the umpteenth time since he often visited his relatives in the capital and thus was quite familiar with the city. Kyle had meant for Leyla to stay at his relative's house, but she politely refused his offer and opted to stay at a small hotel nearby. You must be tired right now. Shall we go tomorrow? I have to study for the exam. When it comes to studying, what is the difference between studying now and studying later before the exam day? You just need to make sure you memorize what you've learned. Wow. You look very confident, Mr. Edman. Of course I am, Miss Lewellin. Well, that's great. So then, let's get married. Instead of hurling her rejection at him like in the past, Leyla set her gaze intensely on Kyle's face. Her sudden shift in reaction made Kyle startled a bit. Why? What's wrong? You know, Kyle. Can you imagine it? Imagine what? We are married to each other and become husband and wife. The moment Leyla stated it with a serious expression, Kyle's cheeks began to burn crimson. Of course. You can imagine it. Go ahead, do whatever you want. I don't know. It strikes me as a bit weird. Us getting married, having children. You know, getting into that type of relationship. What are you saying now? It's not weird at all. Really? We've learned about the act of reproduction, haven't we? How to make and give birth to a baby. Are we really going to do that? Make birth, what? Kyle doubted his ears. He felt like he had misheard something improper, but Leyla, the person who threw the bomb words, precisely had an innocent face with not a trace of shamelessness on it. Act of reproduction. Leyla hurled a bomb for the second time without even batting an eye. There's nothing to be ashamed of, Kyle. Birds, flowers, and all other living things do it to preserve their species. Do you know what you're saying right now? Yeah. I'm only a little weak in geometry, but I am pretty good at other subjects. Kyle's throat tightened, and he turned head sideways to avoid staring straight ahead. He was embarrassed when Leyla seemed so proud of herself after uttering all that saucy stuff. Isn't it a bit weird for us that we're going to do that? And, Leyla, come on. Eat this. Kyle quickly slipped a slice of sandwich between Layla's talkative lips to cease her babbling. Though it wasn't yet summer, the temperature within the train, for some reason, was as scorching as if he were inside a kiln. Leyla munched on the sandwich with relish. In between bites of the sandwich, she mumbled and opened her lips again. Eat this too. Before she could say anything, Kyle had already shoved another cookie into her mouth, clamming her up from speaking further. Please, don't say that stuff anymore. Kyle sucked in everything he wanted to say and just shook his head. Uncle Bill's voice suddenly rang out in his ears. He greeted Kyle with a very kind and creepy smile when he came to the cottage to pick up Leyla this morning. Yes, shovel. Kyle's thoughts wandered back to Uncle Bill's giant dirt shovel, which looked close to a weapon. So Kyle, Layla's lips began to twitch open once again as soon as she finished all the cookies. Her look was a mess yet lovely, with cookie crumbs smeared all over her dainty red lips. Leyla, If you say one more word. Kyle sighed and scratched the back of his head. Huh? If you say one more word. He gulped. After digesting his feelings that had been stifled by the shovel, Kyle made a tragic confession. I'm going to jump off the train. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 28. Fly in the spring like a bird. I respect your decision, but I can't help feeling disappointed. Colonel Farrell, the commanding officer of the military forces, looked at Matthias with a faint smile. Matthias remained still. His countenance was quite ample. I feel like I'm losing a capable officer. Well, it would be a greater loss for this empire if Duke Herhardt were to continue serving in the army with his competencies. However, speaking from the standpoint of a soldier, I'm a little upset, he said. The sense of disappointment and loss in his eyes was earnest, given that they were in a formal military relationship as superior and subordinate. Captain Herhardt, his most trusted underling, who was due to remain in the service for another year, had unexpectedly changed his mind. Imagined his surprise when a paper was delivered to his desk. Instead of the document to extend his service period, a letter of resignation was sent to him. It was his wish that Matthias would stay, but Colonel Farrell had no reason to detain him since the grounds for his appeal, as stated in the letter, was none other than his grandmother, the Duchess of Herhardt. Thank you for all this time. Matthias thanked him politely. He always showed due respect for his superiors even though the Duke of Herhardt was a considerably higher-ranking nobleman based on social status. His attitude was markedly different from that of other aristocratic officials, who were often unable to differentiate between public and private affairs. Colonel Farrell admired Matthias for that. Secondly, if considering his meritorious service to the Empire, his first task by selecting the front line, a problematic area of the outpost, was noteworthy. Make sure to visit me when you come to Rats. Matthias was more than glad to comply with the colonel's request for a farewell handshake. Yes, Colonel. He shook his superior's hand firmly and exited through the colonel's office door, having been entirely freed of his duties. The outpouring of the spring sunshine drifted across a clear blue sky welcoming his steps once he walked out onto the street. Matthias got into his car and drove toward Ratz's downtown. He had to go to several places to meet with some of his other superiors. It was only after then, the farewell activities for his retirement, which had been rolling on for several days, were finally brought to an end. When he was about to walk up to his waiting vehicle, something went by and halted him in his tracks. Matthias turned his eyes towards the end of the road across the street. Over there, came to his sight a figure he used to know. Leyla, a woman who turned out to be none other than Leyla Lewellin, was walking the road leisurely along the promenade at the downtown area. Master. The driver approached him as he stood still and didn't get into the car. Go back first, Matthias ordered him while keeping his gaze fixed on the opposite side of the road. It's Leyla. No way, she couldn't possibly be here. Straight away, with broad strides, he got across the road. The museum she visited was huge. Leyla looked around in amazement at the magnificent building of the Berg Empire Natural History Museum, the same way she did on her first day setting foot in this place. The day after arriving at Rat City, Kyle took Leyla on her first visit to this place. The Art History Museum and the Natural History Museum, which sat across the street, opposite to each other, and were said to be places of Ratz's greatest pride. Leyla had grown used to the grandeur of Carlsbad City, which was reputed to be on par with the splendor of the capital. But she remained so mesmerized by the architectural wonders that lined the streets of Rats every time she passed through them. The girls at her school who toured the capital often gushed about how beautiful the Art History Museum was. Still, Leyla unhesitatingly chose the Natural History Museum to be named the owner of the most beautiful architecture. As Kyle described it, the museum was like a piece of heaven on earth for her. All she could think about was how vast the museum was and how impossible it seemed to be for her to explore every corner of the building in just a single day. Leyla was eager to devote her entire day exploring this place to the fullest extent possible. She also had planned to empty her schedule on the last day to come here once again before leaving Rat City. Hopefully, she would be able to view the whole of the museum's collection and accomplish her mission. Having finally made up her mind, Leyla was raring to go and walked into the museum foyer with a spring in her step. Literally, Kyle wished to accompany her today, but Leyla shunned his goodwill. Unlike her, who had completed her exam the day before, he was just getting started with his exam tomorrow morning. Though Kyle was full of confidence in his brains and had studied in advance, Leyla didn't want to bring him here for sightseeing just one day before the exam. Before entering the exhibition hall, Leyla once again double-checked her outfit, making sure there was not a single hair out of place. Comfortable shoes, checked. Notebook and pen, checked. Stamina in full. I'm ready to go. After drawing out a notebook and pen from her bag, Leyla stepped into the viewing gallery, which she hadn't had a chance to see on the first day of her arrival. Leyla Lewellin today was just like a child at a picnic. Matthias stood at a safe distance away, quietly watching her as she strode through several spacious exhibit galleries without a trace of tiredness devouring her. Matthias was already convinced that the woman's back he saw going inside the Natural History Museum belonged to Leyla, so he quietly followed her while keeping his distance. Curiosity got the better of him, leaving him wondering what the hell she was up to. But soon after seeing what she was doing, Matthias was willing to wait and keep a closer eye on her. As he waited, Matthias suddenly remembered about the college entrance exam that took place in the capital around this time. Seeing that she had traveled to the capital city to take the test, Matthias concluded that she had decided to continue her study at the college. So was her marriage to Kyle Atman as well. Leyla was standing in front of a glass display case containing various plant specimens, diligently penning things down in her notebook. Sometimes, her lips were tinged with a smile, and her face took on a jolly beam as if she was looking at a precious jewel. Matthias was hard to believe that a mere plant sample could elicit such a giggle from her face. In the end, Matthias decided to stalk her a bit further, but he didn't go any closer since he knew her joy would perish whenever she saw him. Matthias folded his hands behind his back and slowly trailed in her footsteps at the same pace. He hadn't seen her since last summer, and Leyla didn't seem to have changed much since then. Even yet, there was only a slight changeover in her delicate appearance from before. Her face had become slimmer, her expression looked more gentle, and every movement of her body appeared more graceful as time went on. Donning a lace-embellished white dress, Leyla seemed more mature than she was before. After she had been there long enough, Leyla left the herbarium exhibition room and abruptly stopped for a while in front of the passage leading to the next gallery. Matthias was able to figure out what had piqued her attention. The passageway that ran between the two exhibition rooms was conjured up in such a way and incarnated like a heavenly place. The branches, painted with silvery hue, were decorated with white feathers and garland hanging like leaves. As the light trickled in through the window glass, the colorful bird-shaped crystal ornaments draping all over the branches reflected its rays. They created a dreamlike atmosphere to the eye, reminiscent of a fairy tale realm, enhancing the magical beauty of the space even more. Gosh! Leyla's naive admiration came to his attention. Matthias couldn't keep a smile off his face as he watched her run about with such abandon. Her wavy blonde hair and the hem of her dress bounced with her as she sprinted excitedly inside the area like a little girl at a playground. In the middle of that beautiful passage, Leyla halted her steps. She stretched out her hand towards the branches, but her fingertips were unable to grasp the bird-shaped ornament. Leyla was still staring up at the ceiling gazing in awe, when Matthias sauntered and walked straight off to her side. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Before she had a chance to realize his presence, Matthias already grabbed her by the waist and lifted her body off the ground. Leyla jolted in surprise when she floated into the air. She turned her head, and a crystal bird, which had previously been beyond her reach, was now right in front of her eyes. She felt like she could fly like a bird in the spring and go anywhere. As if she were dreaming with her eyes open. It was strange, but breathtaking moment. Matthias dropped her down to the floor and acted as if nothing had happened. The hem of her voluminous, puffy white dress slid down her calves and caressed her skin softly on the inside. Leyla raised her head and hid her hand that had touched the crystal bird behind her back. Matthias slowly took off his officer's hat. His pairs of blue eyes, bluer than the sky at the end of the summer, were fixed on her with a dazzling vividity. Below the museum's dome was a little cafe selling refreshments where visitors could rest and refuel their stomachs. Leyla and Kyle had already had lunch at that place when they came on the first day of their visit. Matthias took the lead in heading there. Knowing the meaning, Leyla stood still, a scowl on her face. "It was nice to meet you, Duke. I'm going to take my leave now." At her words, Matthias turned around. Leyla steeled herself, bowed her head in greeting, and began to walk to the other way. "There," he commanded. She refused to comply and took a few more steps, but at the end she failed to escape. Matthias had passed by her and blocked her way. "What's wrong with you?" Leyla looked around her and asked sharply. Some passers-by narrowed their eyes, staring at them in a bit of wonder. "I hate it." "What? Someone like you? I hate it." Matthias' arrogant attitude suddenly drove her up a wall. "You can't be like this to me." Leyla clasped the straps of her bag, which she was carrying over her shoulders. Her hands trembling nervously. I mean, do you want to do something that we shouldn't do?" A smile teased the corner of his lips as he stated it in a somewhat sarcastic tone. For a short moment, a maddening rush swept through Leyla's body and knitted her brows in disbelief. "No." Both of her hands began to shake fiercely after Matthias made such offensive remarks. "Never." A sharp feeling of heat seared Leyla's cheeks. Her face became blazing red as she seethed with rage. The humiliation Matthias piled on her had trodden on her toes. Mainly because how aloof and arrogant he was when he said so. After a few moments of looking around his surroundings, Matthias returned his gaze to her. "I want to buy a cup of tea for an orphan who lives on my estate I happened to meet while in the capital city. What's wrong with me being kindness?" His attitude consistently unabashed even when he said something disrespectful. "There's nothing wrong with that." Matthias spoke coldly. His face lost its grin. "Isn't that right, Leyla?" Ending his question that he had answered himself, Matthias slithered his way to the cafe. Leyla let out a long, weak sigh as she looked at his back. Though she didn't know Duke Herhardt very well, she now knew one crucial aspect about him: achieving everything he desired at whatever cost. The more challenging something was to get, the more valuable it was to own. That man always had to get what he wanted. Giving up, Leyla walked behind the Duke with heaviness in her stride. They were sitting across from each other. Shortly after the takeout order was made, the waiter brought 2 cups of steaming hot coffee to their table. The teacup billowed a cloud of white smoke, which rose into the air, had been laid between the 2 people who were appearing to be silent. "I never thought I'd meet you by coincidence in a place like this." Leyla opened the conversation with some trepidation. She was feeling awkward with the stillness between them, so she decided to speak up first. "In the Natural History Museum, do you?" "I'm not interested." Matthias cut her words, taking a sip of his coffee. "You already know it, Leyla." A smirk hung on the corner of his lips. "I have absolutely no interest in these kinds of things." "Then why you?" "You already know it's not a coincidence." "No," Leyla replied reflexively. Her whole body grew tense, and her heart began to beat in a blue funk. She would rather be an impoverished orphan who would get pity from him. She didn't want to be seen as something else by this man in any way. "All I know is..." The sound of her voice was a bundle in nerves, and Leyla gulped back her agitation for a moment. "All I know is just that, you hate me." Leyla closed her eyes as if she were trying to erase the horrifying memories of their first kiss that suddenly dawned on her. But it was to no avail. Once she blinked her eyes to see, Matthias' blue eyes were still fixed on her, and those memories flooded back in, anchoring her to the nightmare once again. "Right, I hate you." Matthias assented her words with ease. A smile bloomed on his face. "Now, I terribly hate you, Leyla." Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 29. A Failed Wish. The smile formed on Matthias's face faded in a jiffy. When he looked at her with a cold glint in his eyes, Leyla felt her heart leap into her mouth. "I'll leave then." As she spoke, Leyla dipped her gaze into the teacup in front of her, utterly disregarding his presence. Pardon? I won't be staying there anymore. I'll leave and won't be a bother in your estate. Where are you going? Anywhere. She clenched her fist, which began to shiver, together with the chill she felt. Don't be scared, Leyla reassured herself, though she knew it was a fool's errand. Arvis isn't the only place in this world where I can make a home for myself. Her words lost none of their venoms, spewing a thorn as sharp as the blow he spat to her. But Matthias simply gave her the cold shoulder, taking her grumbling as a passing whim. Leyla wanted to flee from her seat and get out of there as soon as possible, but what happened last summer, the day she lost her hat and fell into a freezing river because she refused to eat what he offered her, had presented itself in her mind and pinned her feet firmly in place. She didn't want to go through that trauma all over again. As she set her sight on the teacup, Leyla sipped her hot coffee in a hurry. She almost choked, but Leyla managed to finish it in one gulp, until the teacup revealed its bottom. Then, she sucked in a long breath to calm herself. Leyla, sibilated Matthias, pointing at her. Leyla stiffened and hurriedly took out the money from her purse and put it on the table's edge. Matthias scoffed. What's this? It's money to pay for the coffee I drank. Leyla opened her lips and struggled to get the words out. Her gaze remained affixed on his finger. Do you think I'm the kind of person who needs someone like you to pay for a cup of coffee? I don't know about that, but I don't want to receive anything from you. With that phrase, Leyla felt a chill run down her spine. The trembling began anew as her hands became soaked with cold sweat, and her fingers turned a paler hue. Still, her inquisitiveness won against her, in the end. Because this place wasn't Arvis, where Leyla Lewellin used to live the life of a poor orphan under his world. Lift your head. I don't want to. Lift your head, Leyla. Stop bossing me around. The mounting exasperation tightened her throat. She looked daggers at Matthias with a blaze of indignation burning furiously in her eyes. I am not your maid. A sudden rush of reckless courage had obliterated the ripples of dread that had been roiling within her for some time, heeding her response. Maid? I was obviously raised by Uncle Bill and Arvis, but that doesn't mean that I'm your maid. Is that so? What are you, then? I'm a nobody. The corner of her eyes faintly flushed. I have been and will always be. A sharp pain seared through her feelings right at the moment. Her emerald eyes were moist with tears as she glowered at Matthias. But even so, she still got a hold of him and even ventured to confront him. Matthias just held his coffee cup's handle wordlessly. He mused about the day he wished to strangle Leyla Lewellin, and he longed to do so again right now. The sweltering heat of a late summer day afternoon, when he felt as filthy as his messed-up clothes after rolling around on the dirt ground. When he went ballistic at the acts of a mere worthless woman. What if I had strangled you then? In his mind, Matthias concluded that what he felt at the time wasn't quite as bad as what he was presently feeling. Right now, he felt like a freak. The feeling of being carried away by an inexplicable desire and compulsive obsession over a no-name woman disgusted him the most. Matthias took the money that she had left on the table and rose from his seat. Then, he dropped it one by one onto her lap. Take it. Leyla glowered at him. Taking in her eyes, which turned a livid red, Matthias threw some of his gold coins down her skirt. And this, too. What are you? Thank you, is what you should say, Leyla. Matthias scoffed in ridicule. Similar to how you receive Claudine's money. With gratitude. With courtesy. Leyla's eyes blurred as he snickered, but she wouldn't let her tears fall. She twitched her lips to counter his severity, yet words slinked and slid off her tongue. I've taken away your time, even though you're not my maid, so I'll pay you your labor fee. A great tremor now overtook her. Leyla gritted her teeth, but hot torrents of grief already coursed down her face. If you don't like it, simply think of it as my sympathy for the poor orphan. Tears began to tickle her cheek. Deep emotions stirred with no other outlet but through her long-lasting sobs dripping down like a piece of jewelry. You bootlick a guy who wants to marry you out of pity, yet you wish to sustain your pride for a few coins. How amusing. Matthias' sneer was like an invisible thread that pulled her over. Leyla gallantly scowled at him, But her total disgruntlement had already converted into tears that continued to rain down her cheeks like a river leaving a dam. Matthias walked out of the cafe with a satisfied smile plastered on his face. Leyla Lewellin was a woman who never once smiled in his presence, but she was also the woman who, whenever he came into contact with her, would break down and cry uncontrollably. "If I can't make you smile, then I will make you cry." Her laughter or tears, Matthias loved her in all of her manifestations. If he only could give her pain, he would hurt her as deeply as he could. "At the very least, you wouldn't see me as a tiny blot in your life." Before leaving the cafe, Matthias turned around and gave her face a good stare. Leyla wiped her cheek every few seconds as she cried, her glasses laid on the table's edge. Matthias made a wish as his long stride slowly brought him to leave the Natural History Museum. "May Leyla soon marry the doctor's son, and disappear from my world. And may the tears and wounds I had sculpted, last forever in her memory." The sun had already drowned itself on the west sky sill, but Leyla hadn't returned to her hotel yet. Kyle, looking for Leyla at her hotel to have dinner with her, exited the lobby with a worried face. Though she was a little kid no longer, this city was a stranger to her. Bad people might be clustered everywhere. Well, she has no fear, but still. Kyle took a hesitant stride along the street. His mind was racing faster than his feet. He had assumed she would be at the museum, but it had already closed by the time he had arrived. The search for her had taken him all across town, but Leyla was nowhere to be seen. "Is she lost?" Kyle darted past people, buildings, and trees. "If not, has she met a bad guy?" Kyle wanted to bury all of the negative thoughts that had crossed his head. He didn't even want to consider the possibility. It was then that he found her. Leyla stood before a fountain in the park square at the end of the museum street and dubiously threw a coin towards the statue of the water fountain. "Leyla, come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Her eyes naturally moved towards the direction of the voice that was calling her name. Kyle?" Leyla seemed befuddled, as if she had no idea that she had scared someone out of his wits. "What are you doing here?" Kyle approached her, brushing the sweat-drenched hair from his forehead. "Kyle, why are you here? How about your exam preparations? Does it matter right now? You really? Seriously, you?" Kyle grabbed her shoulder. He slowly drew a breath and let it back out with a loud sigh. It wasn't long before his daunting gasps calmed down a little. "Are you all right? Would you like to have a seat?" Leyla asked. Her eyes were drawn to his face with worry. "Who cares about who now?" Kyle clasped his heated palms over Layla's face and heaved a long sigh that sounded more like a mournful laugh. It was then that he noticed that her eyes had swelled and reddened a bit. "Leyla, are you crying?" "No, I'm not." Leyla answered his question in such a hurry as if she had run out of words, which only made Kyle even more sure that she had been crying. "Why did you cry?" "I didn't." "Who made you cry?" "No one. It's nothing like that." Leyla smiled and gently pushed his hand away. "I just, looked around the museum. Took a walk in the park and made a wish." "Wish?" "Yeah. I saw everyone doing it." Leyla gestured with her finger toward the fountain in the middle of the park. People with bright smiles on their faces were throwing their coins into the fountain and making wishes. "I also made a wish for you to get into medical school." "Are you sure you threw it accurately?" Kyle began to chuckle as he pointed to the water bowl the statue was holding. The disappointed moans of those who failed to throw their coins into the pot resounded across the throng. "Of course I made it," said Leyla with a proud smile on her face. "I'm really good at this thing." "I know. I can already imagine it." "It is already dinner time. Are you hungry? Let's make one more wish before we go." Leyla made a beeline for the fountain, holding a shiny gold coin in her hand. Kyle, to her surprise, obediently trod on his heels from behind. "Leyla, do you seriously want to throw your gold coins there? To that fountain? A penny pincher like you?" In lieu of responding, Leyla pitched the coin with all her might. Unluckily for her, the gold coin hit the edge of the bowl and bounced off towards another side. She gasped and frowned, dismay enveloping her face. "Leyla, are you really good at this? Why don't you believe me? I successfully threw all of my coins in one fell swoop just now." "Just how many gold coins did you throw, huh?" Kyle asked in a giggle at her slipshod feet that wasn't like her at all. Okay. Since I've already given a big donation to the Rats' fountain today, I'll toss in one more coin. Are you going to throw another one? That's enough. Don't do it. Kyle snatched the coin from Layla's grasp, leaving her to scowl and lunge for his hand in annoyance. It must be spent. You may say that, but how many gold coins have you already thrown in there? It's the value of money. Is there money that needs to be wasted for nothing like this? There is. Layla shrieked. Enough. Don't throw any more money. It's a waste. If you want to squander money, let's go and get some ice cream. You really do look like Leyla Lewellin when you say that. Whatever. Kyle shrugged his shoulders and put the coin back into his pocket. Let's go. He knew Layla would reject his hand, but Kyle still extended his to her. Layla lightly clapped his hand and seized the lead by taking a small step ahead of him. Kyle was moving quickly to catch up with her. Hey, what did you wish for? I wished for Uncle Bill's well-being and happiness. Then for you to get into college and become a good doctor. And I wish to be a decent grown-up. That's all of the wishes I had for us. Then what's the last one? The last wish of your failed attempt. That's. Layla's face suddenly grew sour. It's a secret. She abruptly shook her head in disgust and widened her stride. Kyle just chuckled cheerfully, his face lighted up with interest. Let's get something delicious to eat, shall we? I've been frantically running around searching for you, and now I'm starving to death. Dr. Edmund heaved a sigh before he opened the bedroom door. When he switched on the light, he saw that his wife was already lying on the bed. She had been like this ever since Kyle and Layla had left for Rats to take their exams. Dear, dinner is ready. Let's go. Don't mind me. Her voice sounded icy, which contrasted with her lackluster appearance. I understand how you feel, but no. You don't. The generous and benevolent Dr. Edmund would never understand. Her eyes were ablaze with anger. But dear, you also like Layla, don't you? Yes. I know. Layla is a good girl. If it weren't for you and Kyle, I would have continued to like her. Marrying Kyle won't change Layla, dear. It's just that Kyle will marry that good girl that he truly loves. You might think of me as an exorbitant snob, but marriage is a reality. This marriage is degrading our son, and you're allowing it to happen. Dear, the world will keep changing. Someone's social status will soon become an outmoded value. Mrs. Edmund arranged her long, flowing hair into a bun and pulled it up neatly before getting out of bed. She stared at her husband with an upset face. She didn't exactly look like someone who had been starving for days. In a world where people live, social status won't disappear. Even if the title is no longer in use, something else will separate society's social classes in the future. Dear. And whatever the standards are, the fact that Layla is not a good fit for our Kyle will never change. Ever. Rounding off the talk with those bitter words, Mrs. Edmund walked past her husband. Dr. Edmund watched his wife's back, who had left towards the garden, and smiled faintly to the maid, who was standing there looking confused. I'm sorry, Mrs. Becker. Please clean the dinner table. With a sigh, Dr. Edmund followed his wife into the unlit garden at this hour of the night. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 30. I'll do my best. After a satisfying dinner, Layla and Kyle shuffled down a night street, enjoying the ice cream in their hands. Kyle was keen on staying with her, though she had told him to hurry back and prepare for tomorrow's exam. I need to digest the food first so I can properly prepare for tomorrow's test. Layla belted up, unable to come up with a retort to his confident reasoning. Let's walk for a bit then, she said. But Kyle, why do you want to marry me? Layla asked cautiously. The aftertaste of cold, sweet ice cream smeared on her lips. If you're just doing it out of pity. Leyla Lewellin. Kyle cut her off, calling her name firmly, and stepped in front of Layla, who was a little startled by his frigid voice. Do you see me as the kind of crazy guy who marries someone out of sympathy? His unfamiliar expression made Layla freeze in her tracks, and she fell silent. Well, the world is wide. There might be a lot of crazy people who marry for such reasons, but I'm not one of them. Kyle eased the air out of his lungs slowly, letting his temper settle. Do you know why? It's because I love you, Kyle. That's my only reason. Because I love Leyla Lewellin. As he looked down at Layla's cocked eyebrow, Kyle sighed and then chuckled. Who do you think is more pitiful? Me, who's been rejected hundreds of times, or you? I'm the sadder one, Leyla, Kyle said as he began to ruffle Layla's hair and moved a step ahead. He didn't want Leyla to see what expression he was making right now, which must have been pretty silly. As if she knew what he was going through, Leyla followed him from behind, creating some distance between them. After traveling home shackled in deafening silence, the two finally arrived in front of the hotel. Go in, Kyle told her. With a smile on his face, he added, oh, I forgot, I haven't done it today. He slowly lifted his eyes after staring down at the cup of melting ice cream in his hand. He had remembered something. Leyla, let's get married. The turndown was already flashing before his very eyes, though. Yet Kyle felt a little weird skipping it now since Layla's rejection had become something of a daily routine for him. For some reason, today, Leyla, who was accustomed to rejecting his proposal with a nonchalant shrug, was unusually quiet. Kyle looked at her with his eyes narrowed as he studied her attentively. I'm not getting married. He ready to hear such a sweet but heartless response that was supposed to come from her slowly parted lips. But instead, her response was something beyond his wildest dreams. Leyla? Kyle jolted in surprise. The ice cream cup he was holding fell to the ground, soiling the tip of his shoe. The words failed him. He was in a conundrum at her straightforward reply. So, do you agree to marry me? As he made sure, Leyla lowered her head and nodded. You want to marry, right? Me? He repeated the question in a shaky voice. Leyla glimpsed at him sheepishly and nodded her head slightly once more. She was momentarily at a loss for words. But Kyle was already screaming in delight as he held her by the shoulders. Whoa! Their shindig-floored guests at the hotel who happened to pass by stared at them. Kyle didn't seem to care even though Leyla let out her scream when he spun her around. It was a beautiful spring night. A gentle wind was lulling the city back to its slumber. That night Kyle had a dream. He dreamed of marrying Leyla and living their everyday life in complete bliss as an Edmund couple. Leyla once said to him, having her own house with a small flower bed was her long-held dream. She smiled shyly and voiced her happiness. She wished the roses she had planted in the garden were all blooming beautifully. In his dream, he saw Leyla diligently tending to that very flower garden. The little child who was running alongside her was more lovely than a blossoming rose. The sun shone brilliantly, and the child's laughter was brimming with glee. Daddy! The child who saw him quickly came running. She was a pretty little girl who looked a lot like Leyla with her blonde hair. The child, still a toddler, jumped on his feet and welcomed him with her eyes sparkling. The whip of air caressed him as he walked to her with their lovely daughter in his arms. The scent of sweet roses borne by the fluttering wind faintly tickled the tip of his nose in a pleasant way. Leyla laughed as her eyes held his a moment longer. Her smile was so beautiful, perhaps even more beautiful than his beautiful dream had been. In the fading remnants of his dream, Kyle awakened with the phosphine still in his eyes. Thanks to that feeling of happiness, he performed much better than he expected on the exam. He couldn't believe it. Will his dreams soon come true? Is there such a thing as a beautiful blessing in this world greater than that? Once he stepped out of the exam hall, Kyle had the feeling that he could leap the great heights in the sky. His footfall seemed to have wings. He felt free like a bird just leaving its nest the moment he spotted Leyla sitting on a bench outside, waiting for him. Leyla! Leyla raised her head at his shout. She folded the small notebook she was reading and put it back into her sling bag. How was the test? She approached him blithely. Was it hard? Did you do well? You're always worried about everything. Kyle tucked his chin up as though he were flaunting. I'm Kyle Edman. I don't know how to get second place in studies. Oh, ha ha ha. You did great, then. Leyla hooted with laughter. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. I forgot how smart Mr. Edman was for a moment. Wow. That makes me very sad to hear. Make sure you keep it in your mind from now on. Kyle suddenly grabbed her hand. Leyla didn't wave his hand away, though his touch took her by surprise. While she was looking at him, the late afternoon spring sunlight and dazzling crimson gold glowed on the corner of his lips as he gave a gentle smile back to her. "Are you sure you did well on the exam?" asked Leyla carefully, as she looked like she couldn't shake off her trepidation. Kyle grinned at her after seeing how adorable she was. "Don't worry. I won't fail the exam, so there won't be anything bad that may prevent us from attending college together." "That's not what I meant." Layla's cheeks were flushed with rosy pink. The moment he caught the sight of her adorable, sweet ripe peach face, Kyle's heart began to skip a beat erratically. He regretted that they were at the exam location presently. If they had been on an empty street, Kyle would have mustered up his guts to kiss her right at this moment. "No. If I do that for no reason, Leyla will get scared, so I'd better wait for a little bit longer." One of his thoughts wandered back to the shovel, which he had forgotten about. The giant shovel full of dirt, and Uncle Bill's alarming smile. The two slowly hiked around the campus, with hands intertwined tightly. Walking from the medical facility where Kyle would study as a doctor, then to the biology hall where Leyla would be enrolling in the future. They laughed and chatted excitedly and had a great time along the way. "You will definitely pass, but it may be a bit difficult for me," Leyla muttered with a serious face as she reached the biology faculty building. "Why are you worried about that? Didn't you do well on your exams?" "That's true, but only a few female students took the exam earlier." Her countenance became more gloomy as the talk continued. Kyle nodded his head. "Ah. That's right." He momentarily sighed a little. It had only been a few years ago since women were allowed to pursue higher education at the same level as the men in the Empire's universities. Due to the rigorous selection process, only a few students could pass, since the threshold for college admission test scores was much higher for female students. "Still, I'm sure you will pass." Kyle spoke with confidence. "If you don't pass, who else will?" "Don't you think you're being overconfident?" "Not in the least. This is my opinion based on your grades during your 8 years of school." 8 years. So much time has passed already. Leyla could still vividly remember the road she had ridden to Arvis by a mail wagon. Time had passed by in a flash. The well-grown Kyle who was standing before her eyes suddenly felt like a new person. "What's wrong?" Kyle, who was a little embarrassed from the deep gaze fixated on him, asked awkwardly. "You have grown so much." Amazement reigned in Layla's eyes as she stared at him for a moment. Stunned, Kyle was utterly at a loss for what to do, as though fluffy feathers were popping from his chest. Leyla Lewellin's attractiveness didn't appear to diminish even when she uttered such ridiculous things, leaving him speechless. Kyle gave a false smile. He took a deep breath and continued, "Yeah, I've grown up well to be a decent husband. Do you like it?" I don't know." Leyla stiffly hastened her stride. Kyle couldn't stop himself from grinning from ear to ear when he saw her face was daubed with shyness. On their way back, Kyle talked about his pleasant dreams, which would soon become a reality. About the house, how they would live together. Their daily life as husband and wife. And also, their soon-to-be-born, beautiful child in the future. He was keen to write a fresh chapter in the history of the Edmund family, along with their offspring. Kyle cherished the look of cautious eagerness that graced her face when he talked about that dream. He was ecstatic to see those hopes and dreams were on the cusp of becoming a reality. It was a rather funny and sentimental thought. But he believed it was the reason why he was born into this world, to make her expectation come true. "How many children do you want to have?" Kyle asked her. "I wish I had a daughter and a son." "Well, maybe 5?" she answered. Five? Kyle stood gaping. The number she said was in contrast to her timid attitude. "We won't be lonely if we have so many kids," Leyla chuckled and continued. "We can depend on one another. I think it would be great if the house were full of people who resembled one another." For some reason, Kyle felt bitter when he saw Leyla say those things with a radiant look. He could tell by gazing at Layla's bittersweet smile how long she had lived in loneliness. 5. "Okay, Leyla. I'll do my best." Layla's eyes grew round at Kyle's loud pledge. They looked at each other with blank expressions for a split second, Then their cheeks blushed nearly at the exact moment. "Hey, that's not what I meant." Kyle took a step back. He had a redder complexion than hers. "I'm not thinking only about that." "Neither am I," Leyla snapped back, ashamed by his words. The two quickly released their grip and walked a step apart, not daring to make eye contact. Kyle gave Leyla a sideways look, and the peals of laughter he'd been holding in eventually burst from deep within. "By the way, Leyla, did you feel ashamed after deciding to have 5 children?" Gasp. Leyla turned away. Her brows knitted. "You didn't think a stork would give you 5 babies, did you?" Arvis Lewellin, who is well versed in all subjects except geometry. Leyla kept walking, a scowl on her face, disregarding his mischievous teasing. Kyle's jolly laughter grew louder along with the clacking of her heeled shoes. "Oh, wait for me, Mrs. Etman." His jovial cry reverberated across the campus on a sunny spring day. Leyla started to run. Her braided ponytail on the back of her head swung in rhythm with her stomping shoes on the asphalt. Kyle was smitten with the look of her back. Her statuette gave him the feeling of returning to that pleasant dream once again. And he didn't want to ever wake up. Forever.